Hello and welcome to the second day of the Aspen Institute Artificial Intelligence Week, hosted here from Berlin, from something like the Berlin Embassy of the state of Baden-Württemberg here in Germany. The Aspen Berlin AI Conference brings together top policymakers, artists, philosophers, representatives from civil society to talk about the implications of artificial intelligence on the economy, but also on the very way we live, do business and do politics. The title is Humanity-Enabled AI and the Great Economic Acceleration, and the implications on the workforce and industry, education and global tech dynamics. Now, we'll do this throughout the week. My name is Michaela Küfner. I'm the Chief Political Editor of Deutsche Welle. And I will actually switch to German now, because I'm very pleased to welcome Saskia Esken. Herzlich willkommen hier bei der Aspen Intelligence Week. Und zwar freuen wir uns, dass Sie bei uns sind, weil Sie können direkt aus dem politischen Blick und auch aus dem Regierungsblick uns sagen, was Artificial Intelligence, was der Vorschlag der Bundesrepublik ist und wohin auch die Finanzen sich richten sollen. Sie kommen gerade aus der Haushaltsdebatte und vielleicht können Sie uns berichten, es gibt ja die Strategie der Bundesregierung, wie man auch mit den Veränderungen umgehen will und auch in dieser Phase von Corona mit den Fragen, die sich daraus ergeben. Vielleicht berichten Sie, wie zufrieden sind Sie denn mit dem, was Sie bislang erreicht haben?
Das klingt dann auch, als wollten Sie nicht noch mehr Fragen stellen. Die Antwort könnte sehr umfangreich ausfallen, aber ich versuche mal einzusteigen, auch von der Geschichte her, von meiner Rolle her. Als Parteivorsitzender der SPD bin ich ja nun nicht Teil der Regierung sozusagen, sondern es sind Ministerinnen und Minister. Ich bin allerdings Parlamentarierin und ich war bis vor kurzem noch Mitglied der Enquete-Kommission Künstliche Intelligenz, die der Bundestag sich gegeben hat. Und das ist ein ganz wichtiges Gremium auch gewesen, denn die entwickeln ja und schreiben auf Handlungsempfehlungen für den Bundestag und damit auch für die Regierung, für eine künftige Regierung. Und ich fand es sehr spannend, dass wir uns dort erstmal mit der Frage beschäftigt haben, 19 Abgeordnete, 19 ExpertInnen aus den verschiedenen Fachrichtungen, Soziologen, Informatiker, Juristen und viele andere Ethiker, eben mit der Frage, was ist überhaupt künstliche Intelligenz? Was ist der Gegenstand unserer Beratungen? Wir sind sehr schnell drauf gekommen, wir müssen nicht über iRobot sprechen oder den Terminator, sondern es geht um die Dinge, die heute bereits möglich sind und die morgen und übermorgen möglicherweise zum Einsatz kommen. Und dann eben die politischen Rahmenbedingungen, die wir einerseits förderlich dafür aufstellen wollen in Bezug auf Forschungsförderung, aber auch gesetzliche Rahmenbedingungen. Auf der anderen Seite aber auch ganz klar Regeln aufzustellen, die eben unseren Grundwerten auch in Europa entsprechen, Grundwerten, die mit der informationellen Selbstbestimmung, mit Privatheit zu tun haben, natürlich auch mit der Verhinderung von Diskriminierung und vielem anderem mehr. Und da sind wir zu, glaube ich, ganz guten Empfehlungen gekommen. Und insgesamt kann man sagen, dass die Europäische Union dabei ist, einen Weg zu entwickeln, der so ein Stück weit zwischen der US-amerikanischen Vorgehensweise und der chinesischen Vorgehensweise und Umgehensweise mit künstlicher Intelligenz liegt, nämlich ganz klar, wie gesagt, Regeln, Ziele, Zieltreue und Transparenz vor allem auch vorzugeben.
Nun nimmt die Bundesregierung ja über 350 Milliarden Euro in die Hand, gerade in dieser Corona-Krise, um vor allem Industrien hier in Deutschland zu stärken, um halt Massenarbeitslosigkeit auch zu verhindern. Was ist denn Ihre Bilanz? Inwieweit hat diese Krise Entwicklungen, die durch künstliche Intelligenz vielleicht später gekommen wären, bereits vorausgenommen?
Insgesamt hat die Regierung sich bemüht, und da war ich nur wirklich auch beteiligt am Konjunkturpaket, nicht nur konjunkturell wirksame Maßnahmen eben für von der Pandemie betroffene Unternehmen zu ergreifen, sondern auch in sehr weitgehendem Maße Maßnahmen zu finden oder auch vorzuziehen, die in die Zukunft gerichtet sind, die eben Zukunftstechnologien besonders stärken. Und dazu gehört vielleicht auch die Wasserstofftechnologie und die E-Mobilität und diese Dinge, die mit dem Klimawandel auch zu tun haben, aber eben natürlich auch Digitalisierung und auch künstliche Intelligenz. Und ich glaube, dass es darauf ankommt, dass wir in Deutschland, wie gesagt, in der Industrie die entsprechenden förderlichen Rahmenbedingungen auch schaffen. Das hat auch mit dem Datenraum zu tun. Auch der muss in Europa gestaltet werden. Gar nicht so sehr die Entwicklung von Algorithmen. Da sind wir eigentlich schon, finde ich jedenfalls, wissenschaftlich sehr, sehr stark. Aber der Datenraum, der Free Flow of Data, von dem die Europäische Union an der Stelle auch spricht, natürlich im Rahmen dessen, was wir auch vorgeben an Datenschutzgrundverordnung und anderen wichtigen Prinzipien, diese Dinge voranzubringen. Da war es jetzt auch an der Zeit, nochmal zusätzliche Mittel zu investieren. Und das haben wir getan.
Nun will ich erstmal nochmal gezielt alle einladen. Das ist Ihre Debatte hier heute und Sie können Fragen stellen. Also schicken Sie uns die über diese Question-and-Answer-Funktion auf Zoom, wenn Sie uns da verfolgen. Sie werden die Gelegenheit haben, diese Fragen zu stellen. Nicht persönlich, aber ich werde die dann alle vortragen. Und eine Frage würde ich ganz konkret, weil es ist ein sehr bewegter Tag heute, an Sie richten wollen. Und zwar was Corona angeht, das schwebt ja über allem. Nun gibt es die neueste Empfehlung von Leopoldina, das ist die Expertengruppe, die auch die Regierung berät, dass man einen harten Lockdown machen soll über Weihnachten, statt dieser Lockerung, die ja in Aussicht gestellt wurden. Der Staat Sachsen macht das jetzt schon ab kommendem Montag. Wie wird sich denn die SPD da positionieren? Was ist Ihre Haltung dazu?
Also ich finde es wichtig, dass wir die Entwicklung der Fallzahlen und vor allem auch die Entwicklung der Situation in den Pflegeheimen und in den Krankenhäusern, auf den Intensivstationen ganz genau betrachten und dass wir leider sehen müssen, dass wir zwar das exponentielle Wachstum der Fallzahlen bremsen konnten mit unserem Lockdown-Light, sage ich mal, aber eben wir verharren auf einem hohen Niveau, beziehungsweise jetzt steigen die Zahlen wieder leicht. Und wir bringen damit insbesondere die Intensivpflegekapazitäten unter Druck. Und wenn man sich jetzt vorstellt, dass zu dem aktuellen Stand über Weihnachten und anfangs war ja auch Silvester sehr stark mitgedacht, dass wir da zu Lockerungen kommen der Kontakthäufigkeit, dann könnten wir tatsächlich wieder in ein exponentielles Wachstum kommen, was wir dringend verhüten müssen, weil dann stehen wir vor Situationen, wie wir sie in Norditalien hatten, wie wir sie in den USA hatten, dass eben Pflegekräfte und auch Mediziner vor der Frage, vor der Situation stehen, entscheiden zu müssen, wer kann behandelt werden und wen muss man sterben lassen. Und das möchten wir auf jeden Fall verhindern.
Also flächendeckender Lockdown, wie Leopoldina das möchte, ja oder nein?
Wir müssen jetzt tatsächlich zu solchen Entscheidungen kommen, weitere Maßnahmen herbeizuführen.
Gut. Und das hat ja auch Auswirkungen auf die Industrie hier in Deutschland gehabt. Der Fokus, das ist ja ein Teil der Kritik, ist auf die traditionellen Industrien, auf den Autobau, auf die Arbeitsplätze hier zur Verfügung stellen. Wie sieht es mit den Start-ups aus? Bekommen die Ihrer Ansicht nach genug Unterstützung, gerade im Hinblick auf die Entwicklung von AI, was ja, wenn wir schon mittendrin wären, im Prinzip könnten wir ja alle nach Hause gehen, die Pandemie passieren lassen und Artificial Intelligence würde alles für uns machen, oder?
Das wäre schön, ist aber, glaube ich, eine nicht gültige Voraussicht. Tatsächlich kann künstliche Intelligenz uns bei vielem unterstützen, was wir heute tun. Schon Digitalisierung ohne lernende Algorithmen war dazu in der Lage, aber jetzt kommen wir noch zu weiteren Schritten, auch Entscheidungsvorbereitung zu verbessern und sagen wir mal beispielsweise die individuelle Lernbegleitung von Schülerinnen und Schülern zu verbessern, dann möglicherweise auch sowas wie einen Wechselunterricht oder Distanzlernen auch gut zu begleiten und nicht so, wie es jetzt im Frühjahr und im Frühsommer gelaufen ist. Insofern steckt da schon viel Potenzial drin. Es steckt viel Potenzial auch fürs Gesundheitswesen drin, für die medizinische Forschung natürlich auch, aber auch für die Dokumentation dessen, was jeden Tag in Krankenhäusern und Pflegeheimen gearbeitet wird. Da wird ja viel dokumentiert, zu Recht, um Qualität zu überprüfen, aber es ist viel Arbeit, die dann am Bett an der Pflege verloren geht. Und da kann man, glaube ich, schon sehr, sehr viel machen. Ob die Unterstützungsmaßnahmen der Bundesregierung dazu geeignet sind, in der Hauptsache Startups zu fördern oder eher die große Industrie. Ich glaube, wenn es um künstliche Intelligenz und Digitalisierung geht, sind unsere kleinen und mittleren Unternehmen und auch die Startups in der Vorderhand und nicht die großen Tanker, sagen wir mal, der industriellen Produktion, auch wenn die natürlich auch an der Zukunftstechnologie interessiert und in der Entwicklung sind. Ich glaube, dass jetzt die Frage des Lockdowns zugunsten von Corona und zugunsten auch der Gesundheit der Menschen da keinen Einfluss drauf hat. Der Einfluss ist in der Hauptsache gegeben auf den Einzelhandel, auf die Gastronomie, auf die Veranstalter, auf Solo-Selbstständige in der Veranstaltungsbranche. Die leisten jetzt gerade im Moment Solidarität für uns alle und deswegen war es wichtig, da Ausgleichsmaßnahmen zu schaffen mit der November- und Dezemberhilfe und auch mit den Überbrückungshilfen. Aber die großen Investitionen in die Zukunftstechnologien, die kommen allen zugute, die auch in der Lage sind, sie in Anspruch zu nehmen. Das muss man allerdings einräumen, oft hinschauen, dass die Ausschreibungen nicht so hochbürokratisch sind und dass sie vor allem auch kleineren und mittleren Unternehmen auch zugänglich sind.
Ja, Sie sagen ja zu Recht, es sind Überbrückungshilfen. Die Frage ist ja auch, überbrücken wohin? Also wie stellen Sie sich nicht nur eine Post-Corona-Gesellschaft, die mehr AI beeinflusst ist, vor? Und wie stellen Sie sich da die Veränderung der Arbeitswelt vor?
Ja, also zunächst muss ich sagen, haben wir unter Corona-Bedingungen einen starken Fokus auf die Dienstleistungsberufe bekommen, vor allem die Dienstleistungsberufe am Menschen, aber auch in der Logistik. Das sind diese sogenannten systemrelevanten Tätigkeiten, die durch Digitalisierung oder künstliche Intelligenz nicht wegfallen werden. Die werden dadurch nicht ersetzt werden können. Weder Pflegekräfte werden ersetzt werden durch künstliche Intelligenz, noch die Menschen, die für uns die Regale im Supermarkt einräumen und deren dringende Notwendigkeit wir ja jetzt gesehen haben, dass wir diese Erkenntnis haben die aber noch nicht im Geldbeutel gemerkt. Und das ist, glaube ich, wo ich mir jetzt eine Post-Corona-Zeit vorstelle, dass wir nicht produktiven Berufen, sogenannten nicht produktiven, die eben nicht in der klassischen Produktion arbeiten, die Wertschätzung zukommen lassen, die sie auch verdient haben und vor allem, dass sie auch ein Leben finanzieren können und ihre Familien ernähren aus einer Vollzeittätigkeit. Das zunächst mal vorneweg, weil das finde ich wirklich sehr, sehr wichtig. Ja. Und die Frage, wie wir als Gesellschaft in Deutschland und Europa, aber glaube ich sehr stark auch in Deutschland, zögerlich sind, Veränderungen auch anzunehmen und uns damit auch nach vorne sozusagen vor die Welle, das ist jetzt in dem Fall ein bisschen schräg wegen Corona, aber vor die Entwicklung zu kommen. Ja. Das ist in Deutschland nicht so stark gegeben. Wir haben keinen starken Veränderungsmut. Und da jetzt aus der Krise heraus, denn da liegen ja auch immer Chancen, neuen Mut zu fassen, auch stark nach vorne zu gehen, Zukunftstechnologien zu gestalten, nicht als Ereignis zu empfinden, das wir selbst nicht in der Hand haben, sondern zu wissen, wir haben das Primat der Politik als Gesellschaft auch. Die ganze Gesellschaft ist dazu aufgerufen, diese Zukunft mitzugestalten.
Ich würde gerne ein Gegenbeispiel setzen zu den Pflegeberufen, die, wie Sie ja zu Recht herausstreichen, nicht nur systemrelevant sind, sondern da kann man auch niemanden ersetzen. Aber wenn wir konsequent weitere Schritte gehen in Richtung Elektrifizierung der Mobilität, aber auch alternative Energien, da werden im Schnitt 1/10 der Menschen gebraucht, der arbeitenden Menschen, um diese Produkte zu erstellen, auch in der Automobilindustrie. Was ist denn Ihre Forderung jenseits dessen, dass der normale Verbrenner jetzt kein zusätzliches Geld, die Automobilindustrie da nicht gestützt wurde, an genau diese Industrien? Welche Signale haben Sie das Gefühl, haben Sie da gesetzt und wie wird das aufgenommen?
Ja, die Industrien haben jetzt nicht nur die Maßgabe bekommen, wir fördern Elektromobilität und nicht die Zukunft des Verbrenners, sondern sie haben natürlich auch ganz starke Unterstützungssignale bekommen in Bezug auf Zukunftstechnologien, also Forschungsmittel, Forschung und Entwicklung in den großen ebenso wie in der Zuliefererindustrie. Denn gerade die Zulieferer sind ja diejenigen, die viel für die Verbrennertechnologie erstellen, Abgassysteme und ähnliches mehr, Motoren. Und da tatsächlich dann oder Teile da tatsächlich auch dann sich Alternativen zu entwickeln, die nicht unbedingt jetzt mit dem Elektromotor zu tun haben müssen, sondern auch in anderer Form Mobilität oder anderes aus dem eigenen Geschäftsbereich zu entwickeln. Da brauchen die tatsächlich Unterstützung. Man muss schon auch sagen, wenn man in andere Länder guckt und in andere auch Unternehmen. Man hat möglicherweise die Entwicklung ein paar Jahre verschlafen der Elektromobilität und jetzt muss man ein bisschen schneller hinterher kommen. Wir sind der Auffassung, dass die Unternehmen ihre Beschäftigten halten und weiterentwickeln und weiterbilden sollen auch. Die Kurzarbeit ist ja dazu auch ganz explizit angelegt. Wir wollen auch über die Kurzarbeit hinaus mit dem Qualifizierungschancengesetz und mit vielen anderen Angeboten, möglichst auch mit dem Recht und einer Pflicht auf Weiterbildung, die Weiterbildung als ganz natürlichen Bestandteil auch des Arbeitsalltags entwickeln, damit Menschen im Beruf fit bleiben können. Diese Kalkulation der allenfalls 10%, die da noch gebraucht werden, die glaube ich jetzt einfach mal nicht. Es wird ja auch über die Digitalisierung immer wieder gesagt, da gehen massenhaft Arbeitsplätze verloren. Ich glaube das einfach noch nicht, abgesehen davon, dass ich faktisch niemanden kenne, der nicht sagen würde, ich würde mit ein bisschen weniger Arbeit auch zurechtkommen. Das heißt also, weniger arbeiten ist, glaube ich, keine Drohung. Wir müssen nur natürlich den Mehrwert, der sich ergibt aus Digitalisierung, technologischer Entwicklung, auch künstlicher Intelligenz, dann auch gerecht verteilen, sodass auch alle was davon haben und nicht nur die Konzerne, sondern wir müssen dafür sorgen, dass eben im Sinne einer, früher hat man über Maschinensteuer gesprochen, heute müsste man es anders nennen, eine Umverteilung hinbekommen der Arbeit, sodass alle weiterhin Arbeit haben. Arbeit ist ein wichtiger, auch sinnstiftender Bestandteil unseres Lebens, aber natürlich muss auch der Lebensunterhalt verdient sein und deswegen müssen wir zusehen, dass alle im Boot bleiben, alle im Spiel bleiben und ihre Chance erhalten, sich auch weiterzuentwickeln.
Also es gibt ja diese McKinsey-Studie, die sehr oft zitiert wird, dass ungefähr die Hälfte der Tätigkeiten könnten durch AI übernommen werden, aber mitnichten würden Jobs vernichtet werden, sondern ganz im Gegenteil, man könnte sogar mehr Jobs dadurch schaffen. Aber das ist ja immer eine globale Betrachtung. Jetzt sind Sie hier in Deutschland Co-Vorsitzende der Sozialdemokraten und das ist ja Ihre Wählerschaft hier in Deutschland. Wie wollen Sie denn Deutschland vor den Verwerfungen, die daraus entstehen könnten, wenn Jobs auf der einen Seite nicht mehr so funktionieren, nehmen wir das Beispiel Automobilindustrie, was ja eine Kernindustrie in Deutschland ist, aber woanders geschaffen werden, das ist ja nicht notwendigerweise in Deutschland. Was ist denn da Ihre Strategie, dass man das wirklich auch regional schafft und nicht einfach global betrachtet?
Also bislang hat Deutschland solche Entwicklungen immer gut bewältigt und immer so, dass eher mehr Arbeitsplätze entstanden sind als weniger. Wir haben in den letzten Jahren einen hohen Arbeitskräftebedarf gehabt. Wir haben viel Zuwanderung auch gehabt, innereuropäisch und auch darüber hinaus von Fachkräften, die nach Deutschland gekommen sind, um hier ihr Glück zu suchen und auch eine berufliche Perspektive zu finden. Und insofern bin ich zuversichtlich, dass uns das auch mit den weiteren Entwicklungen gelingen wird, wenn wir eben in Zukunftstechnologien investieren und wenn wir auch Mut machen, sowohl den Unternehmen als auch den Beschäftigten. Mit der notwendigen Unterstützung, auch staatlichen Unterstützung, werdet ihr Teil des Spiels bleiben. Wir haben Strukturreformen wie beispielsweise das Ende der Braun- und Steinkohle und auch die nur noch geringe Stahlproduktion in Deutschland bewältigt, weil wir eben entsprechende Strukturreformen auch und Strukturunterstützungen auch gegeben haben und dort eben Technologien auch angesiedelt haben, die dann Entwicklungen und die Arbeitsplätze schaffen. Damit es keine Umverteilung sowohl nicht aus Deutschland heraus als auch nicht innerhalb von Deutschland gibt, so dass eben ein Teil der Menschen keine Arbeit mehr hat und der andere Teil muss immer noch 60 Stunden die Woche schuften. Dafür müssen wir allerdings Sorge tragen.
Sie sprechen auch von staatlicher Unterstützung. Die Bundesregierung hat ja auch den Anspruch, dass sie Normen setzt. Es gab auf dem Digitalgipfel diese Normierungsroadmap. Wie zuversichtlich sind Sie denn, dass Deutschland, dass Europa diese Kraft entwickeln kann, auch wirklich Normen zu setzen? Als Gegenbeispiel in den USA ist ja eigentlich schon längst der Zustand erreicht, dass die großen Tech-Firmen Normen setzen. Wie kann man das als Regierung tun?
Ja, zum einen dadurch, dass eben Standards vereinbart werden, an die sich dann alle halten. Und wenn wir nicht als Deutschland, sondern vor allem als Europa agieren, dann haben wir schon auch die wirtschaftliche Kraft und auch die politische Kraft, um Standards zu setzen. Ich denke, ich darf nochmal die Datenschutzgrundverordnung nennen, die mittlerweile in Kalifornien, glaube ich, entsprechend umgesetzt wird und abgeschrieben wird, wenn man so will. Das heißt, wir setzen schon auch Standards durch Vorbild. Und in vielen anderen Dingen ist es auch der Fall. Die Regierungen der Jahrtausendwende haben starke Impulse gesetzt bei der Frage Luft- und Wasserreinhaltung, also Umwelttechnologien. Und die deutsche Maschinenbauindustrie ist dadurch auch in diesen Jahren sehr stark geworden, dass sie eben eine technologische Ausrichtung anzubieten hatte, die andere kurz danach nachgefragt haben, weil das Bewusstsein weltweit gewachsen ist, dass wir unsere Umwelt reinhalten müssen. Mittlerweile ist es der Klimaschutz. Auch beim Klimawandel schreitet Deutschland ein Stück weit voran und investiert jetzt sehr stark in Wasserstofftechnologie und überwindet gleichzeitig die Atomkraft, die Nutzung der Atomkraft und die Nutzung der Kohle, was eine ziemliche Herausforderung ist. Und da eben daraus auch wieder Mehrwerte und technologischen Vorsprung zu generieren, das ist eine Kunst, die uns erst gelingen muss. Am Ende ist die normative Kraft des Faktischen stärker als die der Normierungen. Aber selbstverständlich ist es auch notwendig, dass in vielen Bereichen, wo meinetwegen Standards von amerikanischen Unternehmen gesetzt worden sind, die aber nicht durchgehend gelten und Gültigkeit haben, dass man auch dafür sorgt, dass da auch die notwendigen Grundlagen für geschaffen werden.
Nun tut sich ja diese Woche Europa mal wieder ein bisschen schwer, gemeinsam zu agieren, wie wir alle wissen. Ja. Aber ein Thema, von dem ich weiß, dass Ihnen sehr am Herzen liegt, ist auch Datenmonopole zu brechen, gerade um auch China was entgegenzusetzen. Die Macht des Faktischen, wie wollen Sie die bezwingen?
Ja, geht es tatsächlich darum, dass viele Unternehmen und der chinesische Staat kann ja sozusagen auch als sehr, sehr großes Unternehmen, wirklich sehr, sehr großes Unternehmen betrachtet werden, mit einem gemeinsamen Datenraum und im Übrigen ohne jede Rücksicht auf Privatheit der Menschen und Privatsphäre. Und Schutz vor Überwachung. Es kommt darauf an, dass wir den Missbrauch der Macht, die sich aus dem Datensilo ergibt, aus dem Datenbesitz und Eigentum, das ja da faktisch ausgeführt wird, dass wir die brechen, weil wenn Sie sagen, da werden Standards gesetzt durch reine Marktmacht, dann ist es eben auch ein Missbrauch von Marktmacht. Da werden Unternehmen und kleine Anbieter auch aus dem Markt gedrängt durch Methoden, die einfach mit der schieren Macht der Unternehmen und der Datenräume bestehen. Und wir wollen dafür sorgen, dass eben solche Unternehmen einer Datenteilungspflicht unterlegt werden. Das heißt, sie sollen Daten, die nicht dem Datenschutz unterliegen, offen zur Verfügung stellen, damit andere, zum Beispiel auch kleine Unternehmen und Startups, aber auch die Gesellschaft, vor allem die Zivilgesellschaft, daraus Mehrwerte generieren kann. Denn Datensammlungen die werden für einen bestimmten Zweck erhoben, aber sie sind nicht alleine auf diesen Verwendungszweck reduziert, allenfalls bei personenbezogenen Daten durch die Datenschutzgrundverordnung. Aber man kann aus Baumkatastern Ideen entwickeln in Richtung Schutz vor Allergien oder Vermeidung von, wenn ich woanders wohnen kann, als da, wo ausgerechnet die Birke vor dem Haus steht. Dann habe ich dadurch einen Mehrwert generiert aus diesen Daten, der im ersten Moment bei der Anlage nicht gedacht war. So. Und die Idee der Datenteilungspflicht muss natürlich auch begleitet werden vom Staat. Der Staat ist immer noch einer der größten Datenmonopolisten überhaupt. Wir verfügen über sehr, sehr viele Daten, sehr viel Wissen und die auch offenzulegen im Sinne einer Open-Data-Verpflichtung des Staates und ein Recht der Bürgerinnen und Bürger, die Daten des Staates zu nutzen. Das ist, glaube ich, auch ein wichtiger Punkt, dass auch da der Staat entsprechend voranschreitet, auch in ganz Europa. Wenn wir uns in Europa zusammentun zu so einem gemeinsamen Datenraum, dann haben wir auch die wirtschaftliche Kraft und auch unsere Wissenschaft hat dann die Chancen, die sie daraus entwickeln kann, die auch wirklich wirksam werden.
Aus welchen Signalen schöpfen Sie die Hoffnung, dass das europaweit möglich ist?
Ja, zum einen ist die Open-Data-Strategie in Europa längst angekommen. Das heißt, da werden auch entsprechende Richtlinien ja entwickelt. Und zum anderen ist sehr wohl auch der wettbewerbsrechtliche Gedanke auf der Europäischen Union ganz klar auf dem Vormarsch, dass man eben auch die Marktmacht der Unternehmen betrachten muss und den Missbrauch der Marktmacht durch die Daten. Das sind Überlegungen im Gange und die werden wir gemeinsam auch weiterentwickeln.
Nun ist künstliche Intelligenz nicht gleichzusetzen mit Digitalisierung. Sie wehren sich da zu Recht dagegen. Aber Digitalisierung und gerade im Bildungsbereich ist ja eine Grundvoraussetzung, um überhaupt zu verstehen, was bei künstlicher Intelligenz auf die Gesellschaft zukommt. Wie werten Sie denn den Erfolg der Digitalstrategie? Oder ich meine, insgesamt wird das ja diskutiert als etwas, was sehr unterschiedlich erfolgreich war in deutschen Schulen. Und wie weit müssen Sie da auch Ihre SPD-Länder zur Jagd tragen?
Ja, insgesamt ist es so, dass die Bundesländer in unterschiedlicher Geschwindigkeit und mit unterschiedlicher Überzeugung auch da voranschreiten. Aber tatsächlich war ich schon ziemlich beeindruckt davon, dass 2016 die Kultusministerkonferenz einstimmig und zwar innerhalb eines Jahres eine Handlungsempfehlung, Gesamtstrategie sozusagen entwickelt hat, wie jetzt die Digitalisierung in den Schulen vorangebracht werden soll. Da war ganz wichtig enthalten auch das Primat der Pädagogik, dass es immer darum gehen muss, dass die Digitalisierung eingesetzt wird, um die Pädagogik zu verbessern. Und natürlich geht es auch um Inhalte wie Verständnis von Algorithmen. Nicht jeder und jede muss programmieren lernen. Ich selbst verfüge über diese Fähigkeiten, aber da es 20 Jahre her ist oder noch mehr, reicht es inzwischen, glaube ich, nicht zu mehr als zu dem Verständnis, wie funktionieren eigentlich Algorithmen. Und das ist schon sehr hilfreich natürlich. Und wenn Menschen verstehen sollen, was mit ihren Daten geschieht, wie sie damit umgehen, wie ihre Arbeit, wie ihr Leben beeinflusst wird von Algorithmen, dann brauchen sie dafür natürlich auch die notwendige Grundlage. Das sind aber eher Unterrichtsinhalte als Ausstattung. Trotzdem muss der Bund, und dazu haben wir eine Grundgesetzänderung herbeigeführt 2017, wieder die Länder und die Kommunen dabei unterstützen können, ihre Schulen entsprechend auszustatten, die Schülerinnen und Schüler und die Lehrkräfte entsprechend auszustatten, damit die eben nicht nur über Medien und über Digitalisierung lernen, sondern auch mit Medien und mit Digitalisierung. Denn natürlich sind die digitalen Lehr- und Lerninhalte beispielsweise wesentlich besser dazu geeignet, auf den Einzelnen zugeschnitten zu werden, auf die einzelne Gruppe auch eben angepasst zu werden, auf den aktuellen Stand gebracht zu werden. Wenn in einem Schulbuch ein falscher Inhalt drinsteht, dann steht ja da 10, 12 Jahre drin, dann kommt die nächste Auflage. Ne? Also im Digitalen lässt sich das leicht reparieren, aber vor allem auch individualisieren und entsprechend anpassen. Das heißt also, auch da ist natürlich, abgesehen von dem Gewicht des Schulranzens, der auch, wenn Sie mal einen in der Hand hatten, eine ganz schlimme Sache ist, weiterhin mit 12 Schulbüchern drin, da kann man, glaube ich, auch ein bisschen was machen.
Das ist in der Tat einer der wenigen Vorteile von Homeschooling, aber derer gibt es wirklich in der Tat sehr wenige. Lebenslanges Lernen ist ja auch ein Thema, was sich die Koalition ins Buch geschrieben hat. Aber in Frankreich gibt es ja zum Beispiel schon die Möglichkeit, dass man im Prinzip so eine Art Lernkonto mitnimmt von Arbeitgeber zu Arbeitgeber. Wo sehen Sie da Nachsteuerungsbedarf?
Wir haben solche Konzepte vorgelegt, konnten sie aber bisher vielleicht auch wegen des mangelnden Interesses des Koalitionspartners nicht umsetzen, dass tatsächlich die Arbeitsagentur auch für eine Agentur für Arbeit und Weiterbildung umgewandelt wird, dass die Arbeitsagentur diese Bildungs-, Arbeits- und Erwerbs- und Bildungsbiografie eben auch führt für einen Arbeitnehmer, eine Arbeitnehmerin oder einen Erwerbstätigen, sodass man da auch sein Leben lang eben die entsprechenden Zertifikate und wo wir in Deutschland sehr stark darauf ausgerichtet sind, auch mitführen kann, aber auch eben einzelne Module vermerkt bekommen kann.
Ich möchte Ihnen noch kurz eine Zahl vorlesen. Also für künstliche Intelligenz hat die Bundesregierung jetzt gerade das Budget erhöht auf 5 Milliarden Euro bis 2025. Dagegen würde ich gerne ein Beispiel aus China setzen. Und Sie kennen diese Beispiele alle. Die Hafenstadt Tianjin gibt alleine 13 Milliarden für künstliche Intelligenz aus. Das ist eine Zahl, die für sich spricht. Was leiten Sie daraus ab?
China und Deutschland zu vergleichen, ist, glaube ich, nicht okay. Jetzt haben Sie nicht China verglichen, sondern diese Hafenstadt, ist mir schon klar. Aber dennoch, wir müssen schon die Zahlen auch in Europa betrachten und wir müssen natürlich auch die Finanzkraft des chinesischen Staates betrachten und die der Europäischen Union. Aber dass wir da noch weiter leisten sollten und müssen, da stimme ich Ihnen absolut zu. Es ist nur eben so, dass wir also derzeit, wenn wir derzeit die Mittel erhöhen, dann tun wir es, obwohl wir ja wesentliche Kosten für die Unterstützung der Unternehmen, die jetzt gerade im Moment unter dem Lockdown leiden, zu leisten haben und das Gesundheitssystem entsprechend unterstützen müssen und so weiter und so fort. Das heißt also, wir sind gerade im Moment schon sehr glücklich darüber, dass auch der Haushaltsgesetzgeber, dass der Bundestag uns zustimmt, gleichzeitig Corona zu bewältigen und in die Zukunft zu investieren. Und dabei müssen wir auch bleiben. Wir haben aktuell ganz harte Debatten in der Frage, zum einen, wer finanziert eigentlich die Kosten dieser Corona-Krise, wie soll das in Zukunft geschehen? Da wird über Vermögenssteuern und Ähnliches gesprochen, aber auch die Frage, wie gehen wir in Zukunft mit der Schuldenbremse um und darf die eigentlich im Wege stehen, wenn es um Investitionen in die Zukunft geht? Und da müssen wir auch ganz klar Wege finden, dass wir immer sicherstellen, unter allen Umständen auch sicherstellen, dass Deutschland seine Investitionskraft als Staat und als Innovationstreiber eben auch behält.
Naja, nun gut, jetzt habe ich eine Hafenstadt, eine chinesische Hafenstadt einem gesamten Land gegenübergestellt. Wenn überhaupt, wäre das ja fast unfair gegenüber China. Dann stellt sich die Frage, es gibt ja diesen Cyber Valley in Deutschland. Es gibt aber auch, das wird von vielen Seiten immer beklagt, dass die Experten sehr schnell abwandern, weil sie dann ganz einfach andere Bedingungen haben, um zu forschen, andere Budgets. Und 353,3 Milliarden, das ist das Paket, was die Bundesregierung wegen Corona geschnürt hat. Das ist ja ein Ungewicht. Also das ist ja die Frage, wie viel gibt Deutschland aus, um to see another day, um durch diese Krise zu kommen und wie viel, um dann den nächsten Schritt in die Zukunft zu sehen.
Ja, also jetzt ist es der Anteil des Zukunftspakets im Konjunkturpaket nicht unerheblich gewesen, aber er besteht nicht nur in künstlicher Intelligenz, sondern insgesamt natürlich haben wir die digitale Infrastruktur zu bewerkstelligen. Sie sprachen von der Ausstattung der Schulen, ohne die auch irgendwie die künstliche Intelligenz nicht zum Fliegen kommt. Und natürlich müssen wir auch investieren in die Verkehrswende, wenn wir den Klimawandel bewältigen wollen, und in die Energiewende und vieles andere mehr. Das heißt also, da ist viel Zukunft drin, auch eine zukünftige Entwicklung der Unternehmen, aber nicht alle Unternehmen, die jetzt am Wechsel vom Verbrennungsmotor zum Elektromotor ihre Geschäftsfelder verlieren, gewinnen dann ein neues Geschäftsfeld durch KI. Da gibt es vielleicht auch noch andere Möglichkeiten, sich zu entwickeln. Also es ist nicht alles KI, um es kurz zu sagen. Wir haben eine Menge investiert in zusätzliche Professuren. Auch die müssen entsprechend finanziert werden, aber vor allem müssen die Leute entsprechend bezahlt werden. Das kann ich auch nur bestätigen.
Gut, jetzt kommen wir zu den Fragen hier von Ihnen allen an den Bildschirmen. Zunächst, wie sollte Europa und Deutschland sich in Bezug auf die ethischen Herausforderungen im weltweiten Wettbewerb aufstellen? Sollten wir starke Standards durchsetzen und so riskieren, im weltweiten Wettbewerb zurückzufallen? Oder ist es besser, sich den globalen Prozessen anzupassen?
Ich glaube, dass die europäischen Standards und ethischen Grundsätze, dass wir die nicht über Bord werfen dürfen, nur um dem Wettbewerb zu genügen. Ich sehe zum Beispiel an der Entwicklung der Privatheit und Verschlüsselungstechnologie und vieles andere mehr, dass solche Grundhaltungen auch eben in die Welt getragen werden können. Das heißt, da kommt dann auch was zurück, was bisher vielleicht in den USA, ich hatte ja Kalifornien genannt, relativ frei war, wird jetzt eingestampft. Die Stadt San Francisco hat Gesichtserkennung in der Öffentlichkeit verboten. Zum Beispiel, ja, also das sind, die haben dann eben eine Entwicklung 5 Jahre lang oder 10 Jahre lang ausprobiert und haben gesehen, was macht es mit der Gesellschaft, und machen jetzt Schritte zurück. Wir würden eher restriktiv da vorgehen von vornherein. Und ich glaube, dass wir die Möglichkeit haben oder eigentlich die einzige Möglichkeit haben, durch ethische Grundsätze auch entsprechend Vertrauen zu schaffen, dass die Menschen uns auch nicht von Bord gehen, wenn es darum geht, dass wir künstliche Intelligenz auch einsetzen können. Denn Intransparenz und Diskriminierung und die Vorstellung als gläserner Mensch, als gläserner Beschäftigter auch zum Beispiel, durchs Leben zu schreiten, ist erschreckend. Und wir wollen nicht, dass die Menschen erschrecken, sondern dass sie Vertrauen haben und Zuversicht. Und dazu gehören eben auch unsere ethischen Grundsätze.
Hier eine Frage, die ein bisschen in eine andere Richtung geht, aber eigentlich auch sich an dem Thema, wie viel Geld wird zur Verfügung gestellt, orientiert. Gegenüber Investitionen in KI in den USA und China sind europäische Investitionen marginal. Wie kann die EU erhoffen, einen dritten Weg zu gehen, genau den Weg, den Sie gerade beschreiben, wenn nicht das nötige Geld bereitgestellt wird?
Ja, tatsächlich haben wir jetzt, und da ist eben die Krise auch wieder so ein Fingerzeig gewesen, die Europäische Union ja hin zu einer sozusagen eigenen Finanzpolitik auch entwickelt, durch diesen Recovery Fund, der auch ein sehr starker Zukunftsfonds ist, der investiert und der aber auch angewiesen ist auf eigene Einnahmen. Das heißt also, die Europäische Union wird weiterentwickelt in ihrer Finanzkraft, die dann nicht mehr alleine aus der Finanzkraft der Mitgliedsländer entsteht. Da ist ja gerade im Moment wird eine heiße Debatte drum geführt, weil damit verknüpft die Fragen der Rechtsstaatlichkeit sind, wo sich Ungarn und Polen noch querlegen.
Ja, da sind ja aber auch eher die Signale, dass sich das eher noch fragmentiert. Also das ist ja nicht, ganz im Gegenteil, da sind ja nicht die Signale, dass man sich überhaupt auf diesen Haushalt und auf dieses Rettungspaket gesamt einigen kann. Das
Ich gehe davon
verschärft ja
aus, dass wir uns am Ende darauf einigen können werden.
Sie sind davon überzeugt, dass man mit Ungarn und Polen sich auf was einigen kann?
Man wird sich auf eine Lösung einigen können und wir werden weiter schreiten in der europäischen Einigung, weil es notwendig ist.
Ich würde Ihnen gerne ein Zitat von Sigmar Gabriel nennen, der jetzt im Hinblick auf die Frage, inwieweit er es vermisst, sich in seiner SPD zu engagieren, geantwortet hat. Also sein Urteil ist relativ vernichtend. Wenn man draufschaut, wie wenig sich die eigene Partei mit dieser Welt und der Rolle, die das für Deutschland, Europa und die SPD bedeutet, auseinandersetzt, dann ist man doch ganz froh, dass man da keine Verantwortung mehr trägt. Was sagen Sie dazu?
Ich habe, glaube ich, eine kluge Vorgehensweise, mit solchen Äußerungen umzugehen, indem ich sie nicht kommentiere.
Gut, hier noch eine Frage. Was halten Sie von den Versuchen, einen globalen Rahmen für KI zu schaffen, wie er in der UNESCO, der OECD und den G20 verhandelt wird? Wie können diese globalen Regulierungsversuche mit den europäischen Ansätzen verbunden werden? Dazu muss man natürlich wissen, dass die nicht notwendigerweise gerade im G20-Rahmen überhaupt rechtsverbindlich sind. Also da müssen wir differenzieren zwischen Erklärungen und rechtlich bindenden Regulierungen.
Ja, da hängen wir ja noch sehr stark in der Luft und müssen auch da, sowohl wie in der Europäischen Union, auch auf internationaler Ebene dafür sorgen, dass sich die auseinanderstrebenden Kräfte, die eben ja auch vorhanden sind und die mit dem Brexit und auch mit der Präsidentschaft eines ehemaligen amerikanischen Präsidenten verbunden sind, dass die nicht weiter Fuß fassen, sondern dass wir in den Fragen auch beieinander bleiben.
Hier nochmal eine Frage zur transatlantischen Partnerschaft. Die US-Amerikaner erhoffen sich von der EU, ein Partner gegen China zu sein, auch im Feld der KI. Wie weit sollte sich Europa auf diese Partnerschaft einlassen? Und wir hatten ja auch im Vorfeld besprochen, dass die USA da auch einen ganz anderen Bezug zu Daten und wie Daten verwendet werden haben.
Auch da entwickelt sich einiges, sowohl in Bezug auf die Daten als auch in Bezug auf die Marktmacht. Ich glaube, die stärksten Signale in der Frage, müssen große Plattformunternehmen zerschlagen werden, kommen derzeit nicht aus der Europa, sondern aus den USA. Insofern, ich glaube, auch da ist einiges im Fluss. Und natürlich ist Deutschland und Europa klug beraten, nicht nur mit den US-Amerikanern, sondern auch mit anderen Akteuren in aller Welt, gute Beziehungen aufrechtzuerhalten, und zwar nicht nur kurzfristig, sondern über lange Frist auch. Der Welthandel ist für Deutschland als Exportweltmeister ein ganz, ganz entscheidender Faktor. Und das geht nicht in eine Richtung. Wir haben nicht nur ein bilaterales Verhältnis jetzt mit den USA, sondern wir müssen immer multilateral unterwegs sein.
Gut, die Frage ist, ob wir diese Wahl notwendigerweise in Zukunft auch haben. Die USA wollen ja doch sehr deutlich, dass sich Europa, auch gerade Deutschland, Richtung USA und somit auch gegen China positioniert. Und das ist ja eine Frage, da merkt man auch, dass die Bundeskanzlerin die eigentlich gar nicht wirklich beantworten will. Wenn man sich zwischen den USA und China entscheiden müsste, wie würde sich eine SPD da entscheiden?
Man muss sich nicht zwischen USA und China entscheiden. Man muss mit sehr großer Sorge betrachten, wie die Chinesen derzeit in Asien agieren. Und das ist nicht zu lösen, indem wir uns gegenstellen und zwei Pole entwickeln, wie wir sie im Kalten Krieg auch schon mal hatten, sowohl von Wirtschaftsräumen her als auch politisch. Das ist kein guter Weg gewesen und es ist auch für die Zukunft kein guter Weg. Und wir müssen alle Akteure und alle Partner auch mit der entsprechenden mit der entsprechenden Wertschätzung begegnen, aber auch natürlich an den Regeln arbeiten, wie man zusammenarbeitet. Und da haben wir ja gerade in den letzten Monaten hart in der Frage gerungen, wie geht man im Kern des Betriebssystems unserer digitalen Gesellschaft, also im Kern des Internet mit Komponenten von Herstellern, wo wir nicht so sicher wissen, wie viele Hintertüren da eingebaut sind.
Gut, da wird ja auch eine klare Positionierung aus den USA erwartet und mehr.
So ist es, und wir haben auch mit den USA immer wieder Auseinandersetzungen in der Frage, wie sicher sind unsere Daten eigentlich bei den Anbietern, bei den Cloud-Anbietern zum Beispiel, die eben ihre Server nicht hier in Deutschland stehen haben, sondern woanders. Wenn da entsprechende Gesetzgebung gegeben ist, dass der Staat jederzeit darauf Zugriff hat, dann haben unsere Unternehmen da kein Vertrauen, denn wir wissen aus den Snowden-Akten, dass das Interesse der NSA nicht ausschließlich politischen Zusammenhängen gegolten hat, sondern immer auch sehr stark wirtschaftlichen Zusammenhängen. Das heißt, Wirtschaftsspionage ist auch das Geschäft der allgemeinen Spionage, und da müssen wir auch darauf bestehen, dass da Sicherheit gegeben ist.
Gut, da gibt es auch die europäische Initiative jetzt Gaia X, aber ist das die Antwort?
Das ist eine mögliche Antwort. Wir müssen sowohl Alternativen anbieten, es wird sich nicht auf Gaia X beschränken, sondern wir werden auch Plattformen, Kommunikationstools, denken Sie an den französischen Staat, der Signal als Basis für einen Behördenmessenger jetzt herangezogen hat und nicht etwa WhatsApp aus nachvollziehbaren Gründen. Wir müssen für Alternativen sorgen, wir müssen immer wieder auch die Open-Source-Alternativen stärken, tatsächlich nicht nur in Sonntagsreden, sondern auch in der Beschaffung unterstützen, damit wir Alternativen haben und damit wir dann auch in eine Position kommen, überhaupt Standards und Vorgaben zu machen.
Hier noch eine Frage zu Afrika. Wie sollte sich Europa in Bezug auf die Digitalisierung in Entwicklungsländern positionieren, vor allem in Bezug auf die wirtschaftlichen Beziehungen zu den afrikanischen Ländern? Wo ich auch noch mal zur Debatte stellen würde, ob bei der Digitalisierung die afrikanischen Länder jetzt immer hinterher sind. Da gibt es ja sehr innovative Ansätze, gerade was die Bildung angeht. Ja.
Durchaus, da gibt es sehr innovative Ansätze und sehr spannende, zum Teil entstanden durch Zusammenarbeit auch mit unserer GIZ, aber auch natürlich aus eigener Kraft. Insgesamt ist der globale Norden klug beraten, sich da auf Augenhöhe auch zu begeben mit den Staaten, um auch voneinander zu lernen. Denn wer jetzt in die Technologien einsteigt, auch in Bezug auf den Klimawandel und vieles andere, wer jetzt in moderne Technologien einsteigt als Gesellschaft, hat womöglich einen ganz anderen Ansatz als wir, die wir schon 10 oder 15 Jahre unterwegs sind und da schon womöglich falsche Abwägungen an Stellen genommen haben. Das heißt, man kann immer voneinander lernen, ist klug beraten, auch die als echte Partner zu betrachten.
Wenn Sie einen Wunsch frei hätten, was wäre der größte Brocken, den Sie aus dem Weg räumen würden im Hinblick sowohl auf Digitalisierung, aber auch den aus Ihrer Perspektive sinnvollen Einsatz von künstlicher Intelligenz in Deutschland?
Ich würde gerne haben wollen, dass wir durch Bildung und durch starke Schutzrechte den Menschen Sicherheit geben, dass sie jederzeit Herr ihrer Daten, ihrer digitalen und tatsächlichen Identität sind, und dass sie auch, was die Erwerbsarbeit und Teilhabe am gesellschaftlichen Leben anbelangt, jederzeit die Weiterbildung bekommen, die sie brauchen, um sich auch weiterentwickeln zu können.
Was haben die Deutschen aus Ihrer Perspektive, und Sie können ja programmieren, Sie kommen ja im Prinzip aus einer sehr digitalen Welt, über künstliche Intelligenz noch nicht verstanden?
Dasselbe, was die Abgeordneten in dieser Enquete-Kommission nicht verstanden hatten. Einerseits eben ja bei künstlicher Intelligenz an iRobot zu denken und andererseits gar nicht zu ahnen, von wie viel künstlicher Intelligenz wir bereits umgeben sind, wenn wir ohne Navi nicht mehr nach Hause finden, dann aber Glück haben, dass wir dieses Navi haben, dann basiert es auf künstlicher Intelligenz und wir verlassen uns drauf, übrigens ohne jede Transparenz. Da glaube ich, dass noch auch viel Information und Bildung notwendig ist, um da ein gesundes Verhältnis und einen gesunden Blick auch auf die Realität zu erschaffen.
Können Sie mit mir kurz eine Voraussage wagen in 10 Jahren? wie sieht dann die deutsche Wirtschaft aus? Wird die Automobilindustrie immer noch die treibende Kraft sein und werde ich überhaupt noch vor Ihnen stehen? Macht das dann künstliche Intelligenz?
Also ein Blick in, wie sich die Welt in 10 Jahren entwickelt haben wird, das finde ich in heutigen Zeiten sehr, sehr mutig, sich sowas auszudenken. Ich hoffe, dass wir uns weiterhin gegenüberstehen. Das möchte ich ganz klar sagen. Wir werden, wenn wir jetzt diese Zeiten der Distanzkonferenzen und Distanzlernens und der Distanzarbeit und Homeoffice und so weiter erleben und der Kontaktvermeidung, dann erleben wir ja auch, dass uns was fehlt. Und ich glaube, dass es wichtig ist, dass wir menschliche Begegnungen und auch menschliche Entscheidungen aufrechterhalten müssen. Das ist, glaube ich, ein ganz wichtiges Pfund. Und darüber hinaus muss ich sagen, als diese Geräte vor ein bisschen mehr als 10 Jahren erfunden wurden, ist noch gar nicht so lange her, ne? Ich glaube 12, 13 Jahre, sowas.
Schon ein bisschen.
Haben wir geahnt, was damit passieren würde und wie diese Entwicklung unsere Gesellschaft verändern würde. Wenn man heute auf einen Bahnsteig schaut, wenn der Zug 3 Minuten Verspätung hat, dann stehen 98% der Menschen da und gucken mal nach, was so auf dem Handy passiert. Das ist unglaublich, wie sich die Welt entwickelt hat. Ja? Und da zu wissen, was in 10 Jahren ist, ob möglicherweise die vielen Funktionen, die wir heute in diesem kleinen Hochleistungsrechner mit uns rumtragen in der Hosentasche, ob die möglicherweise wieder auseinanderlaufen in viele Einzelgeräte, die wir vielleicht im Ohr, in der Brille oder am Arm tragen werden, wir wissen es nicht. Aber ich hoffe, dass wir als Gesellschaft die Kraft uns bewahren, die Dinge so zu gestalten, dass sie den Menschen dienen.
Saskia Esken, Co-Vorsitzende der SPD in Deutschland. Herzlichen Dank, dass Sie mit uns hier gesprochen haben. And thank you all for following this debate. We'll just take a very short technical break and we'll be back with you on a debate about labor in the age of automation. You will be able to ask questions to Roger Bootle, he's an economist, Janina Kugel, the former human resources head of Siemens, who now advises the government on questions of labor, the MP Johannes Fogle from the Free Democrat Party, and the trade unionist Andy Stern, who says it's time for a basic income for all. That's coming up in just a couple of minutes from now. Thanks for watching us. Welcome back to the Aspen Institute Artificial Intelligence Week. From proletariat to precariat, labor in the age of automation, that's the debate we're about to have right here, right now. Now, the historian Yuval Noah Harari predicts that just as mass industrialization created the working class, the AI revolution will create a new unworking class. He's even as drastic as to predict, quote, people would be rendered useless, not my words, to creating wealth, unemployable because skill is replaced by algorithm. Now, while we all agree that AI will change the working world, we're here to try and decide today whether we are staring into an abyss or an ocean of opportunity. And here on Zoom to debate just that with me is Roger Bootle. He's an economist and chairman and founder of the economic research company Capital Economics. One of the things he rightly predicted against the trend was the dot-com bubble bursting. He also holds the Wolfson Prize, and he's written a book called The AI Economy: Work, Wealth, and Welfare in the Robot Age. He says we should be optimistic that although AI will eliminate and change lots of jobs, it will create lots of others, in particular machines, and AI will never be better than humans at being human. I'm also very pleased to welcome Janina Kugel, who's a board member, advisor, and speaker. She used to head human resources at Siemens, and she also advises the German government as part of the Labor Council of the German Labor Ministry. Currently, her Twitter feed is a lot more about the women's quota in German boardrooms than AI, but she's previously said that a strong society is one that is not afraid of change. She predicts that, yes, AI will destroy jobs, but it will create others. Labor will stay. I'm also pleased to welcome Johannes Fogle. He's a member of the Bundestag's Free Democrat Party. He's Labor spokesman of the Free Democrats here in Germany. And before becoming an MP, he worked at the German Labor Agency. About AI, he says, the big technological developments in the past and today have been accompanied by a fear of surging unemployment, yet they ultimately led to more employment. Change can be challenging, but if we embrace the potential of digitization, we can create new jobs and new industries. And we'll ask him about how he plans on doing just that. Also with us is Andy Stern. He's co-founder of the Workers' Benefit Fund. He's president emeritus of the Service Employees International Union, which has some 2 million members. He says change is inevitable. It's progress that's optional. And over the last 25 years, technological advances and automation have been far more beneficial to the wealthy than they have been to workers. This is not an act of God or preordained, but without increased worker power or government intervention, the future's massive technological disruption to work and jobs will leave workers even farther behind. So let me start with Roger Bootle. Roger, I'd like to actually get you to respond to that. You are optimistic that jobs will be created, but please pick up what Andy Stern said. How optional is real progress and actual wealth for all? Ich höre nichts.
It could be true that the future could turn out to be extremely bleak. From an economic theoretical point of view, you can see circumstances under which there was effectively no demand for human skills or human activity, and large parts of the potential workforce were unemployed. That's possible. I think it's highly unlikely for a variety of reasons. Firstly, there's the historical evidence that some people have already referred to. Similar arguments have been put forward throughout the whole of history, and they proved to be completely unfounded. So I think we can be more specific than that, and it goes to what you mentioned in your introduction about my views. There are lots of skills and activities that human beings have taken part in over the years, many of them actually not being very enjoyable or fulfilling, which are going to be replaced by robots and AI. But then there's this whole aspect of human beings interacting with other human beings. Now, if in the future, because of things like COVID or other such things, people didn't want to interact with other human beings, they actively wanted to be as far away as possible from other human beings, then there might be a problem. But I really can't see that, whether it's education, whether it's social care, healthcare, all sorts of things, even advice about how we look, how we should develop ourselves. I'm pretty convinced convinced that human beings will want to interact with other human beings, and that's where there will be the source of future employment. Now, whether and how there's a role for government there, that's another question, which I guess we may come on to.
Andy Stern, let me get you to respond to that. You say there must be a role for trade unions. If anything, they must be strengthened, and there is a role for government, a stronger role to play. What do you mean by that?
Well, I think what we've seen is even when we increase the number of jobs, it doesn't mean that they're decent jobs with decent work. And so many of the jobs that people are predicting, like in the care professions, whether it be home care or child care, at least in the United States, are jobs for women of color. They're not very well paid. They have few benefits. And so, yes, we can increase those jobs, but we will just continue to increase the inequality that exists, and that the benefits of AI and technological change goes to a smaller and smaller group of people. So without intervention, without some form of redistribution, I think you're staring at a pretty Hunger Game type future for workers in the world.
Janina Kugel, I can see you nodding, actually. You have hands-on experience of restructuring as part of the corporate restructuring Vision 2020 Plus and Siemens. And you are now advising the German government, which of course is concerned about just that the future of labor, AI-driven labor, would deliver wealth for few. What is your advice that you are giving?
Well, I think it's like what Andy said is you have to make a clear differentiation whether, for example, you speak about jobs and the structures that you find predominantly in the United States. And if you look to Europe, where you have a different style and different social security system, I think it's very dangerous to always compare industrial worlds one with each other, because I think structures are different. Nevertheless, I think is for the time being, everyone has always believed that the task of upskilling and reskilling should lie in the responsibility of employers and employers only. And so pretty much that would actually mean is like once you have finished school or your primary education, it depends pretty much like on yourself and on your employer. But I think here comes exactly the point. Employers do only invest in people that they believe they can use also later on. And here comes the point in the massive change and disruption of technology. The states and the government needs to take an active role in first creating transparency of what other jobs could actually come up, and also, what are the requested skills and qualifications you need. Secondly, a financing of it. And third, also, honestly, just like places where people can study. And at the most optimistic situation, that should actually happen while people are still employed in their old jobs before they lose their job. But if you think at how things work today, either the government doesn't do anything or they wait until people get unemployed and then you retrain them. And that is far more expensive than if you would offer opportunities to retrain them and upskill them and reskill them into jobs. And clearly I confirm with Andy is like, it doesn't make sense to have thousands of jobs that actually, come up where people can survive, but they cannot make up a living, because then we see what is going to happen if democracy falls apart, if social imbalance becomes stronger. And I think that is a role where every government in the world that I can at least recall needs to change their strategy totally different than they have done over the last centuries of industrial revolution.
Johannes Fogle from the pro-business Free Democrats. Now, your party has uttered scathing criticism of the current corona budget, I'll just call it that right now, because you feel that the status quo is being conserved way too far. Now, you yourself have been in charge in a previous professional existence of retraining people to make them fit for the next employment. At the same time, you say you're optimistic, particularly for aging societies, that if we embrace the potential of digitalization, we can create new jobs and new industries. Where does your optimism come from?
Well, I'm an optimist in general, but I think if you look at the big transformations in the past, I mean, there always has been the situation that there will be a lot of new jobs coming up if we are innovative and if we're innovative enough and our productivity is high enough. But of course, the big question is, how do we enable everybody, really everybody, to be a part of this process? And so it is about education. Yes, we are a pro-business party, but we also are a pro-education party. And what I think is that Janina Kugel made the right point. What we need is like a whole second education system. In German, in the German language, the word ausgelernt is pretty important. I mean, normally you end your education after you finished your vocational training system, which is very successful in Germany, or you finished your university. And after that, the numbers we have like right now is that 2/3 of the workforce are not regularly participating in further training, no reskilling, no upskilling, not on a regular basis. And I think that's the problem. We need a whole second education system, not only if people are unemployed, but before. And of course, that is a job for the companies, within the companies. Of course, that is a job for the federal employment agencies to support that, not only if people get unemployed, but already before. And I think we thirdly need really new instruments. For example, we have a famous a student support system called BAföG in Germany. And I think we need like a whole new system. We brought up an idea to create a so-called midlife BAföG, so that you financially support everybody earning less than the average income, in, for example, being able to invest in their own re-education, reskilling, upskilling, and we need new instruments like that. And of course, this is an area where we need more state activity and more instruments. So it's not that pro-business, free Democrats means we're against state activity. It depends on what state activity in which sector.
So it's something like a student loan system that there is in Germany, where people have to pay back parts or all depending on their parents' income.
But only parts, and that's the point. I think we need a new support system where perhaps with loans, but not only with loans, especially for the lower incomes, after university. You know, for the whole 2/3 or 3/4 of your life after you finished your first education.
Andrew Stern, because since you're sitting in the US, isn't that exactly what would be debated as big state in the United States?
Let me just take one step backwards and be a little bit provocative here. I think, and Janina's right, if you look at Germany, you live in a different universe in terms of the role between business, government, and the state. And I would hate to hold you up as the way the rest of the world works, because in most of the world, like the Industrial Revolution has decimated large numbers of industrial workers in the UK and the US. Very few have found jobs, whether there's been retraining or trade adjustment assistance in our country, that have been very fulfilling. Being a greeter at Walmart is not really what you want to do after you spent 20 years with a middle-class union job. And so we've created a whole system of community colleges in our country. They failed us completely. We've talked about them for 30 years. So we have no model that I would say in most countries of the world where upskilling, reskilling, education is an answer to this problem, particularly for people in their middle ages who get displaced, as opposed to how do we train younger people, as we've seen with computers, who found jobs because they were familiar with digitization and technology right from the beginning, as opposed to their parents and grandparents who are very unfamiliar with it. So I think Germany's in a nice dream world because you can actually do these things, but the rest of the world is going to be overrun by displacement, by good well wishes of get yourself a job or a college education, which college kids in our country are underpaid and undervalued and doing work that is underskilled. So even getting a college education is what we told one generation has really failed them.
I just want to say to everyone watching out there, we will also, of course, get to your questions in about 25 minutes from now. So please get them in early so they have a good chance of being answered. And I'd like to ask Roger Bootle, because, of course, you do a lot of economic policy analysis. And the last thing many companies actually, and that's the one thing everywhere in the world would want to hear right now, is that once they've managed to survive Corona, there's extra responsibility for them to take on new challenges in terms of long-term training for their own staff. So having agreed that there's no silver bullet, what kind of advice are you giving governments and what should they not be doing?
Well, I think I agree very much with what Andrew and others have said, that here there is surely a very big role for government. I mean, to some extent, individuals can provide for their own interests here, but not all individuals can. They may not have the financial resources to start. And to some extent, companies can help with this. But I can't remember who said it earlier on. The fundamental problem is that there's a big externality here, as we economists say. If you, a company currently employing someone, invest a fortune in training them up, you've got no guarantee that that person's going to stay with you. So you are bound to underinvest in training them. This is an area where the state, it seems to me, got a very, very major role, often in combination, cooperation with private sector employers. I agree very much with the comments made earlier at Zandy, I think, about the education system. Certainly the solution to the problem isn't, I think, to shove more and more of our youngsters through university, we call it in England, I guess you'd call it college in the States, and equip them with the sort of degrees that they have won recently, because these are proving, frankly, in many cases, next to useless. So the key to this issue is, first of all, reforming the educational process itself so that kids come out of school, college, university, call it what you will, not only with specific skills, but perhaps more importantly, an adaptability and a preparedness to carry on learning new skills through their lives, and that also that we establish financially and institutionally the processes funded by the state by which people can adapt and change those skills as needs arise. Those are, I think, the fundamental things. What I don't want government to do, and I think that's where I think the danger lies, is making its mind up as to where the new jobs are and then putting in an awful lot of effort into subsidizing and promoting those sectors, because I think it's pretty clear that no one can be absolutely sure where the new jobs are. I've got my suspicions, but I don't really want government involved in all that. I do want government involved big time in overcoming the market failure with regard to education and training, and in particular being very compassionate about people who, for one reason or other, are left behind. And again, someone else made reference earlier, I think it was Andy again, to the Industrial Revolution. I wasn't quite clear whether he meant the first Industrial Revolution or the more recent one, but he's right in both cases. We have this word, don't we, in English language, Luddite. I don't know if you have that in German as well, referring not favourably to this chap Ned Ludd, who supposedly in the early 19th century went around smashing up machinery on the grounds that this destroyed jobs. And in the economics textbook, of course, Ned Ludd is portrayed usually as some sort of idiot who was operating against progress and destroying jobs and prosperity. I mean, the key thing is that as far as people like Ned Ludd was concerned, he was right. The machines did destroy jobs early on, and large numbers of working people lost their livelihoods, and the state did not intervene to give any support. And to some extent, that's been true in Britain and America over the last 30 years as a result of losing jobs primarily to technology and also to China and East Asia. So we mustn't make that mistake again.
So Janina Kugel, I mean, you're very much accustomed to the corporate perspective. What did persuade you in the past? What does persuade an employer to invest heavily into lifelong learning of its own staff? Also, of course, running the risk that that's an investment that won't pay off for their own company.
Well, I think Raja made a fair point that of course is like the better people are getting educated, the higher the risk is that they go somewhere else. And again, here I would make a differentiation between, for example, what you would find in Central Europe or in Germany compared to some of the Anglo-Saxon world, where you have equal standards and you have trained workers. And not only, and I fully agree to college degrees or university degrees are not making the trick. While we have an over-academization of people, and we need to have the right skills on a working level, and especially more techniques and more mechanical and engineering know-how comes into there, you need to have a skill thing. And here comes exactly my point. When you have a system, like for example, you have in the United States, people leave high school, and then pretty much the only thing that they are getting if they don't go to college is training on the job. As an employer, you need to invest a hell lot, and especially if technology arises, to train them that they are able to be really productive. And if you measure the amount of hours that workers are productive, you would be scared of the number you're actually going to figure out. So this is one of the things, it's not a cheap thing to do. So as an employer, investing in your people and treating them and giving them fair working conditions and good benefit situations, depending on which country you're operating, also keeps up a very high probability that they're going to stay with you. You will always have to make a differentiation between, let me call it the global elite, people that are super well skilled and they could work anywhere. And I'm speaking not only about those with an academic background, welders, for example. Welders can choose wherever they want to work and they get awfully a lot paid because they have something, they have a skill that is still very much demanded and no robot can actually like totally replace it to this point. And I personally don't believe it will. The other thing is some of the skills, digital skills, technical skills, how to interact in the new world of technology are skills that are highly demanded in every industry. And there's only few people that do bring those skills along. So as an employer, even if you could fire everyone that you wanted, right? I mean, which is impossible in Germany, you will not be able to rehire the people, at least not for a fair deal, because they are requested anywhere and it's awfully expensive. So here I would always say is like retrain the people that you're having. And if you do that, just to give you a very practical example, if you, for example, work on a shop floor and you still have people that are carrying around the goods, to bring them to the production belts, and then at some point you, for example, implement a fully automated logistic plant, still you need to know which part needs to be where, whenever. And if you take, and it doesn't take longer than 6 to 12 months, depending on the pre-education of everyone, to retrain the people to use the logistic systems, they know everything already. The only thing that they don't know is instead of like moving carriages around, they have to sit on a computer and train everything there. And here comes what Andrew said is, of course, the younger generation is a little bit more likely to learn how to use computers, but the others also do have the know-how. So that also, I think, requires a rethinking of like whom you need to reskill, but coming back also to us individually. And I, for example, always ask the question to everyone, if I have an audience, that I always like say, how many times and how many hours do you invest every week or every month into learning new skills that you don't need for your job today? And it's interesting to figure out that there is a high amount of people age 40 and older that don't invest any time in there. So it's also us that need to stay employable. So for me, the responsibility is pretty much like also from a business perspective. If you don't invest in the people that you know, that you trust, and have been working for you, you will first of all not get them on the market. And even if you get them on the market, they will be more expensive than if you retrain them. So I think it is a rethinking also for companies, because most of the companies see training as an investment, as a cost, and not as an investment into human resource that they need further on.
Johannes Fogle, are you going to convey that message to the big employers here in Germany? Or do you not have to?
Well, I do it already all the time when I have a conversation or a little chat with them about the topic. But I think Janina is 100% correct. I mean, that's just right. But like I said before, as a politician and as somebody who has worked before for a government agency, I definitely do see a role for state activity here, a large role for state activity here. I mean, we would all agree across the aisle, no matter what party, that one of the most important jobs the state and society has is taking care of proper education. The thing is, how do we define education? When does it end? Does it end at the beginning of your working career? Or is that one of the ideas of the past that we have to overcome? And I think we have to. So there is a role, like I said before, there is a role, of course, for the big companies. And Janina Kugel laid out why it is rational for them to do so. But I also think that there is a large and growing role for the state. And I say it as a liberal in the European sense, but I really believe it here.
Andrew Stern, so can we call off the employer crisis that could be sparked through artificial intelligence?
Can we call it off? Not at all. I think, as Roger said, we're all making predictions, without much based on the past. And maybe because I come from a country where we have a president still who defied all predictions, all norms, all behaviors to create a new normative set of values, that it's hard to believe that things can't change despite, decades or centuries of history. So, I think we do not know, and we've never had a situation where machines can think. And I'm not saying having agency. I'm just saying having beyond automation and before agency, and even in Janina's example of the logistics, in most of those situations, there's far less people at the end of the process than there were at the beginning of the process. So, we can talk about this in stark terms of we're going to eliminate all jobs. But I think as you opened with the McKinsey study and other things say there are an enormous amount of tasks that more and more can be done by machines, different than kind of the machines that put the windshield in the, oops.
No, you're coming across fine. We heard you.
Okay, that put the windshield in the car, but machines that actually can do a certain amount of thinking. And therefore, I don't think this crisis is over, and I don't think we need to wait to see who's right, Roger or I. I think we need to do scenario planning. There's no reason to sort of say, let's just see who wins this race. Let's talk about if Roger's right and I'm wrong, then a lot of these things will be a lot easier. But if I'm right, what are we going to do? Are we just going to let people fend for themselves? Where's the money going to come for the social safety net for all the people that are unemployed, as we've learned in the COVID crisis? I think we have a very cavalier attitude at the elite that somehow this is all going to work out. And the people at the bottom who are going to pay the price, are not so lucky if it doesn't work out.
Roger Butler, I'd like you to respond to that, really, because when we talk Germany, we talk about a system that, of course, doesn't translate even to the United States or other Western countries. But can you please just do a quick analysis for us? When we talk about jobs changing, jobs basically no longer existing and other jobs being created, can you do some kind of geographic prediction? Is this all going to take place within national boundaries, or isn't part of the problem that you have tens of thousands of jobs created in one corner of the world that are lost in a different corner? So you have very regional problems to a global trend.
Well, I think this is going to be who knows, in deference to what Andrews has said, but I think it's going to be quite different from the impact on jobs that occurred through globalization, which, as you rightly say, redistributed jobs all around the world. I think what we're likely to see, actually, is similar processes operating more or less everywhere, with one exception. And this goes to my worries about too much state intervention, and certainly my worry about the state trying to restrict the advances of AI. I think if we were to do that, then I could see the West losing a large number of jobs again to countries in the East, which didn't so restrict the advances of AI. And I think governments should be very conscious of the danger of over-regulating what happens with robots and AI, and pretty much allowing the market to decide that, and then concentrating on the issues we've been discussing. That's to say, training and retraining on the one hand, and if necessary, generous provision for the losers from this process on the other. I agree with much of what Andrew has been saying, but one thing I wanted to take issue with him on, the notion that if we get machines and AI doing large amounts of activity and the rich becoming richer and the poor becoming poorer, that somehow or other, where on earth is the money to come from for social programs? Well, money's there to come from precisely the first bit of that statement. That's to say, look, either you believe that AI and robots are going to increase productive potential, or you don't. If they increase productive potential, then they also increase the potential to redistribute income, the poorer members of society. Now, that's not necessarily going to happen automatically, and that's very much where I agree with Andrew. And of course, some countries, maybe the United States will be one of these, wouldn't do enough. But in principle, if this revolution adds to productive potential, then it adds to our potential to help people at the bottom. And that does demand that we have the right institutions and the right policies. But the potential is, in my mind, definitely there.
Johannes Fogle, as a German MP, I just had Saskia Esken a short while ago, the co-head of the Social Democrat Party here in Germany, telling me, well, that is actually a good thing if we all work a bit less and there's the income still being produced. It's a question of distribution. Do you agree? Is that where you should, or is that where the FDP is making proposals?
Well, I'd agree that it's a good thing that if jobs are changing, that there also is an overlying trend that stupidity is going down, and people tend to have more interesting, diverse jobs. Of course, like we talked about it before, that of course we have to make sure that everybody is able to cope with that. But there's also a chance in that. But I think I'd agree with what Roger just said, that of course we have to, I mean, we are not living on an island, and we live in a globalized world. We have, for example, China doing a great effort with the, top-down, state-led top-down innovation. Surprisingly, that's not what I'm convinced of the way of the future for us. But of course, we have to hold our productivity high, and of course, we have to invest in what makes us strong, which is bottom-up creativity, I'd say. But if we just getting lazy and working less, I don't think that's going to happen, and that's not how we solve the transformations of the past. For example, I remember the debates. I was younger, but of course I read a lot about it. And I remember the 90s where we had the debates about the industrial robots. I mean, we had the debates in Germany as well, that everybody is going down, leading to disaster. I can remember the Spiegel, the news magazine Spiegel covers saying Germany, robots and computers, they will lead to mass unemployment and all that. And we decided in Germany to have a much higher use of industrial robots, to invest in innovativeness and keeping our productivity high. And in the end, it worked. I mean, it doesn't lead to high unemployment. The opposite happened. Of course, we had to do some social reforms as well. Of course, we had to do redistribution. That's all correct. But you can only do that if your innovativeness is high enough. And I don't think that laziness leads to that.
But how would you then weigh, I'll get to you in a moment, Janina, how would you weigh up the question of who sets the norms for the use of artificial intelligence in the future? This is also something Saskia Esken was very strong about. She sees Germany, sees Europe in the role of laying down those norms. Do you believe that is something that is achievable even by Europe?
Well, I think so, but only, and she's right with that. I'd agree on that in general. Of course, we have to have a debate about the details, but of course, you have to set the norms. That's what we as democratic societies do. But I think Europe can, but only the whole of Europe. And that's, I think, is nearly the most important point here. Of course, we have to use the might and the power of the large single market and to use it in the digital age as well. I think that, for example, GDPR was a not so bad example for that. It was not well implemented, and I had a lot of debates about it with small and medium-sized companies, for example, in my constituency in the Sauerland, very rural but highly industrialized, and they sort of they were like, well, why do we have to care about it? But I think the idea that we use the power and the might of the single market, its sheer size, and to set rules in the digital age, perhaps different rules to set the democratic gold standard, for example, in for all these questions in difference to China, I think is perhaps one of the most important rules we have for the European Union in the upcoming years.
Janina Kugel, you wanted to respond to a point.
I wanted to respond to a point which pretty much like also goes to what Johannes Fogle just said, is I think we're still very narrow-minded in thinking in Europe, the US, and all of that. I think latest, we already have a globalized economy. And with AI, it needs to be very clear that we cannot speak about skills in Europe. And I think that's the arrogance of the highly industrial countries in Western Europe and the United States or North America, that we still sometimes believe we are ruling the world and we will do that. And I always say is like there is super high and skilled people in India, in China, and they are highly competitive and they are not worse equipped than anyone else in Western Europe or in North America. And I think, therefore, we have to look at it as a global competition. And we need to understand that those times are over, where pretty much like the high demand innovation is done in the West, and the rest will pretty much like produce in the East. It has already shown, when you think about like the high-tech companies, there's 3 US players and 1 Chinese players, and Europe is far behind. It will never pick it up again. Because, and here I agree with Roger, what Roger said is like, my point was not about state and government coming in there of like trying to set the norms, because the world is far too fast and it will move. And also with ethics, okay, if Europe wants to define it, and I think there is a lot of in favor of it, we need to hurry up, because China will make its way anyway, one way or the other. And if we debate and they set the norms, it's too late. But what I believe needs to be totally reinterpreted is like, what is the basic education that we provide to people? Because Andrew and Roger both said, and I fully agree, we don't know how jobs will look like in 5 years or in 7 years or in 10 years. These people, I would say, it's like you can maybe look ahead for 18 months, but not more than that. So what we need to provide everyone is like being flexible and having the basic skills to be retrained all the time. And I think this is a total different contradiction of like how to define it. And my last comment to that, we also have to understand that in the Western world, we are not as hungry as some people in the East. I mean, what I always like said in my global roles is like, if you believe you can do the same job in 30 hours and just like to give that, Germany is already among, how many hours does a person work over the year, is already at the lower bottom, in terms of productivity. So if we believe that only because here someone wants to work less, which I think is from a personal perspective always something nice, we need to understand that there's someone else out there in the world with the same skills that is willing to work double the time to make an effort for his or her own life. And I think that is what we need to look at. It's a global competition, not only in terms of production, but also in terms of resources.
Andrew Stern, what does that mean for the whole concept of collective bargaining? If exactly that is the case, you have on one hand whole societies having the debate about work-life balance, less working hours, and at the same time people who want to use every opportunity for upskilling to at least get a foot in the door in terms of economic progress and actually flatly jobs. What challenge does that hold for trade unions worldwide?
Well, I'd say 2 things. First of all, I think we make these very broad generalizations, and I appreciate that that's the way we talk. But the truth is, what drives a business is not 100% of their workforce. There's a skilled group of people. I think someone was saying, that even if you got rid of the current group, you couldn't hire back the skills you needed. That's not true at every level. That's just true at certain levels, because some jobs can easily be trained and skilled, but you're not going to find a great digital director or marketing director or finance person, overnight. And so, I think we have to be careful, because I do think that, 20 or 30% of the people, will always work really hard, will be more entrepreneurial. That's what their jobs will expect, and that's what they will do. And then other people, the job doesn't mean quite as much to them. It's more of a source of income and satisfaction. But, whether they work 30 or 35 or 40 hours is just a different factor. I think what's important here is we always talk about business and we talk about government. And particularly government's just kind of a brute force, non-targeted, actor in the space. We don't have sectoral thinking necessarily done by government. We don't have enterprise. We don't have geographic thinking. And, one of the values of having workers and unions and others involved is when they're acting responsibly, we can get a much more cooperative, targeted way to solve problems. And in our country, for instance, if you give everyone, paid sick leave, at a basic level, it's really significant. The question is, what is the differentiation between an Uber driver getting sick leave, and how does that work? And how does that work for a care worker? And how does that work for an executive? Government doesn't do a very good job differentiating. So I think there's an enormous role of trade unions, if trade unions are willing collectively to, as I started off by saying, that understand that change is inevitable. We are not going to stop change. We are not Luddites. It's progress that we should be focused on. And progress does deal with education. And as Roger said, redistribution and generous, benefits for the people that are the losers who may be too old or not have the right abilities to do that. And so, I think unions need to really not be the ones who are saying, how do we regulate everything, but how do we regulate that workers do well going forward, whether the training happens or doesn't happen, they shouldn't pay the price, if there is a systems failure by government or business.
Roger, I'd like to take that back to you once again, because is it then, will this happen? Will this precariat suddenly exist because governments are too slow, transition is too fast, just because it happens historically through artificial intelligence? Is Hariri right who predicts that there will be people who are rendered, and I quote once again, not my words, useless to wealth creation, who actually are potential beneficiaries of a system that they no longer have a part in, of creating wealth?
Well, we've been saying before, but I want to re-emphasize it. We just don't know, do we? And this makes government action particularly difficult, and I think particularly dangerous. We have to some extent, I think, roll with events. Now, I'm actually rather more optimistic than some people who've been speaking on this issue, because you used the word suddenly just then. I don't think it is going to be sudden at all. It's going to be gradual. It's amazing. If you look back 10, 12 years ago at what people were saying then about what will have happened with regard to artificial intelligence, yes, some of it has transpired, materialized, an awful lot of it hasn't. I think we're going to see that we are going to have time to develop new policies and approaches. In that regard, what's been said and debated a moment ago about leisure is, I think, tremendously important. I don't think it's right to characterize the idea of people spending more of their life at leisure than working as being lazy. And nor do I think that this opportunity to take that choice means that you're, as it were, losing out in the global competition against China and Asia. That's to say, I think it's perfectly feasible for people in the West, including Germany, the States, Britain, all these countries, to say, well, I think I'd rather work fewer hours. I recognize that means I'm going to earn a bit less income than I would have done if I'd worked 40 hours or whatever, but I can still have as much money as I've been getting over the last year or two, thanks to the benefits of artificial intelligence. Now, the results of all that would, of course, be that the economies of the West would decline in size relative to the economies of the East if they made a different choice, the ones in the East. But so what? That's open to us to make that choice. And I think choosing to be less stressed, spend more time on leisure pursuits, more time with your family than hard at work all the time is not being lazy. And after all, if you look back over the last 150 years, that's exactly what people in the industrialized countries have done. If you look at average working hours across the year in nearly all our countries, you'll see a massive reduction over the last 100, 150 years. And we haven't become lazy because of that.
Janina, I'd like you to respond to that.
Well, I can actually only say yes, I agree. I mean, if you look, 100 years ago, you were working 7 days a week or 6 days a week, and now it has been the unions. Like, I don't know, Andrew, when that has been like 100 years ago, that they pretty much, like you said, is like Saturday is off and Sunday is off. I agree, but it comes back, Roger, to the fact is like, what is the work that we're doing, and what are you getting paid for? And it also comes back to one of the first statements that Andrew said, we pay much less for care work, even though it becomes even more important, especially in societies that are becoming constantly more older than, for example, those that actually are the industrial jobs. My pledge will always be that I think this is another, I don't want to call it industrial revolution, but it is to a certain extent. And I think we have to let go from everything that we have done so far. I mean, not let go from everything, but we have to really think in some reforms and not, believe in everything that we did in the Industrial Revolution, where you pretty much like had jobs from 8 to 5 and where you could measure the time. With all of the flexibility, we need new norms, we need new regulations, and we need new ways of thinking. And for example, what I would say for Germany, we always have pretty much the same approach is like there is one fits all solution for whether you work in a plant or whether you have a highly skilled job that you could do pretty much like all around the time, or pretty much you work in a global time. And we don't even have yet the flexibility to our labor legislation to apply to all of the different jobs. So what I would like us to think is like to stay with what we need for the job groups where we also need to have some security. And yes, I am a strong believer that having a social security, having a free democracy as we know it in the West and as we define it in the West, and have some democratic stability is going to be a benefit for everyone in society. Living in the world or living in countries where you have the ultra rich people and the ultra poor people is not going to bring you the stability that you also need to grow. So in that respect, I only think is we need to let go from some of the beliefs that we had over the last 30 or 40 years after the Second World War, and we have to define new standards and new beliefs to actually master the future and keep, I think, the social security as we at least know it in Europe. And I think this is a pro. And as Andy said, I think this is something where we are better off than North America.
Johannes Fogle, because you're a lawmaker, I would like you to respond to that particular point when it comes to systemic reevaluation of who delivers stability in Germany, who delivers actually stable conditions for a democracy, because at the end of the day, and we're not going to get too deep into that, but we are in a system competition between China and the West in terms of being able to deliver. We've seen this in the pandemic, which is a particular point in case, but of which certainties would you be willing to let go? Care workers were mentioned here. They're actually demonstrating outside the German health ministry today because they've been told a lot of times that they are system relevant, and yet they are low earners here in Germany. So what needs to be reassessed in the cold light of day, and what is needed in the future, and which skill sets cannot be replaced through artificial intelligence?
Well, a good question, but a broad question. First of all, I'd like to add on what Roger just said. I don't think that we have a disagreement there. My point was just that I think we have to keep in mind that, of course, it all is working if we as a society stay innovative and productive. The productivity is high enough. Of course, that's important. And what we learn in the pandemic, and of course in crises shows the character, I think. And what we learn in the pandemic is we see some areas where, of course, we had, I think the false priorities. Care workers is a good example. We had the debate for quite some years before. But now I think it's finally obvious for everybody that, of course, we have to bring up a payment for not only for care workers, but also for medicine personnel when it comes to ambulance drivers and all these kind of jobs and important roles in our society. And I would also say that what Janina just said is correct, that we also see that a lot of the rules we had, are no longer fitting to the modern reality. And that became obvious in the crisis as well. For example, I don't think that we have to work like a day more per week or something, not at all. But we're already seeing that people want to be more self-determined when to work and where to work. And we can see a cultural change taking place during the Corona crisis when it comes to the use of home office, when it comes to the use of mobile working and all these modern self-determined ways to decide for yourself where to work and when to work. But we see that the rules, the laws are not fitting at all. I mean, what is taking place today in Germany is for millions of people every day are breaking the law. no one cares about it because we're in a crisis. But of course, in a rule of law society and a rule of law state, that's not going to work forever. And the answer could only be that we modernize, I think, the laws we have here. For example, when it comes to the labor regulations. But I would also like for 1 minute to add something what Janina Kugel said in the statement before, which is we have a lot, which is who is the West these days? You asked before who's setting the rules when it comes to AI regulation, for example. And what we can see, of course, that we have fundamental disagreements when it comes to ethical questions to China or the Communist Party of China. And the question is, who is responding? Is it Europe? Is it Europe and the US? Or should we define the West defined as democratic, free societies in the Pacific century on a global level? Do we have enough cooperation when it comes to the free nations of Asia? Shouldn't we set the rules when it comes to ethic regulation of AI, when it comes to trade, investment, more together? I mean, we don't have a single organization on global level where Asian, American, European, free democratic societies come together and debate on these questions. Not a single organization. And I think that shows that we have to, modernize our mindset as well. Who do we have to work together with in the Pacific century we're already living in?
Andrew Stern, I would like to pose a question to you, which is coming from the audience watching us here. Populist parties have become a big problem on both sides of the Atlantic because megatrends such as globalization have created groups of winners and groups of losers. How do we make sure that we take the whole society along with the next major trend? I think AI is meant by that.
So I think people are exactly right. I mean, it's odd that in our country, the Democratic Party, which used to be the party of the workers, is now much more the party of the college educated. And the Republican Party is becoming much more the party of the workers because the workers have not benefited in all the changes in society. So I think, we all know that, people having less, earning less, feeling forgotten, are very good organizing grounds for people who have different motivations. So to me, it's a very simple question. I think Roger said it, much better than, certainly with more credibility. If we're going to keep producing wealth as a world through technology and productivity, how is it going to be distributed? And when, 5 people in the United States have as much wealth as 50% of the people, we have a problem. When Amazon pays no taxes, we have a problem. And so, we all can talk about, what does it mean that, people are upset and angry? Well, they've been left behind. They worked hard. They did everything that society asked them to do. And they found themselves to be in a position where what they had dreamed of and hoped for is no longer true. And we've done nothing for them but tell them to get a college education, which hasn't worked either for their children and put many of them in debt. And so why would you expect people to not respond to people who pay attention to their grievances rather than people, who tell them to go get a college education?
That brings us actually to a very hands-on question, clearly aimed towards Janina Kugel. What would you recommend your children or grandchildren to study or train in right now? In other words, which professions will be the next to be made obsolete and which fields will become more important in the future? Welding, I understand.
Welding would be one. I mean, first of all, I have to say I'm worried that someone believes I already have grandchildren, but nevertheless,
somebody was thinking very far into the future.
And recommendations to children about from the parents is always a bad thing. What I would definitely recommend them is, first of all, I would always recommend that do something that you enjoy doing, because I think whatever we do, we spend a lot of it. But keep that mindset open that you have to relearn and learn new things constantly. And I think this is for me the only good thing to say, because if I would now give a recommendation, what are the jobs that are missing today? I mean, we have seen that over the last 30 decades or like 3 decades as well. I mean, then you give a recommendation 10 years later, you're not searching for those people anymore. So I think what we need to understand is, like, you start in one job, that is not going to be the job that you retire. And secondly, just to really come back, and maybe that is again a very, a very privileged statement, but nevertheless, I think we need to understand that the ambiguity of the world is going to increase. And therefore, I think we also need to have people that do understand that there is no simple answers to some of the big questions out there. So I think you need to have a thorough know-how also about what is going on to make the right judgments. That will be my recommendations. And I would hope, and I would be very proud if I could give the answer. But I think Roger, Andy, and every one of us said is like, there is not the one thing what we can predict the future. And so I think is stay open and be ready to learn constantly.
Roger, one more question with begging you to give us a very short answer to a complex question. One of the recommendations of the ILO Global Commission on the Future of Work was to guarantee social protection from birth to old age that supports people's needs throughout their lives. Is that realistic, and how could it be implemented? You can make it a yes or no question. Is it realistic?
You want a short answer? You want a short answer?
Yes, please.
No.
Thank you very much. I saw that one coming, actually. That's why I knew it would be brief. Thank you to Andrew Stern, Johannes Fogle, Roger Bootle, and to Nina Kugel for joining us here today. And in a couple of minutes from now, I will be handing over to my colleague for this day, Sarah Polak. She's an Aspen young leader. She's a trained archaeologist and anthropologist, but worked for the past 7 years on tech startups. So she's living proof that you don't continue to do what you trained on already. Sarah will have a conversation with Michael Betancourt on the cultural impacts of artificial intelligence. That coming up in just a couple of minutes from now. And to my whole panel, thank you so much for joining us today.
Pleasure.
Welcome back to the Aspen Artificial Intelligence Week here from Berlin. And I'm very pleased to hand over to my colleague for today, Sarah Polak. And I can tell from the pre-chat you just had with Michael, you have a lot to talk about. So please take it away for us. You're going to be talking about the cultural impacts of artificial intelligence.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me. I'm also particularly honored because I'm a member of the Aspen Institute Central Europe. So it's really nice to see the Aspen family come together like this. Yes, we just had a bit of a eureka moment with Michael, or Professor Michael Betancourt, here in the pre-chat, because his father is an archaeologist who is very active in Minoan Crete, and I'm originally an archaeologist as well, and I actually recall writing essays about the things that his father wrote about. So that was a very exciting moment. And I think that it actually highlights really nicely the multidisciplinary nature of the talk that we'll be having, because AI is often seen, especially by the public, and often sensationalized by the media, as a very new type of technology that is only basically reserved for the IT elite, but it definitely isn't that way. We need to approach AI as a new steam engine, as a new invention of writing, because it's essentially a new invention for humanity that's going to shift us into the next evolutionary stage. And I'm really excited to be having this chat with Michael, because he embodies multidisciplinarity as an artist, as a critical writer, as a film expert, someone who really lives and breathes the world around him. He simultaneously sees the practical and socioeconomic impacts of AI, especially on the job industry, but also what I particularly love, just to give you a bit of a teaser of the presentation, manages to tie it beautifully with the philosophies that our modern world has risen from, and things like the Industrial Revolution, which have often dictated the way in which we work and live and structure our lives. So I won't say any more than that. It's a great honor to be here with you, Michael. I'm glad that we're having this multidisciplinarity AI chat. And I've got loads of juicy questions prepared for you, and I'm sure that the public will as well. But for now, I will keep stumm and give space and place to your wonderful presentation that I've seen already, but I can't wait to see again, because absolutely breathtaking. So take it away.
Have I been switched? Okay, here I am. Now, let me just share screen. And the presentation. All right. I'm going to be talking about the cultural impacts and impediments to what I'm calling the post-labor society that AI presents. This talk is a discussion of insights derived from my analytic work with digital capitalism, and it's specifically a summary of a book called Force Magnifier that was written as a response to the invitation to do this conference last year. This is a talk that's going to discuss 7 issues. I'm going to go through them in order and talk about what they are and what their ramifications are. But I want to start with the question, which is really rather obvious and which we don't seem to ask very often about automated systems and AI. What does AI automate? And the simple answer is human agency. But it's important to keep in mind that not all forms of human agency have the same cultural importance, and not all forms of AI have impacts on production, nor do they all necessarily displace human agency in the same ways. So, keeping those things in mind, it means that we're only going to be talking about a limited range of applications for AI, and in relation to a very particular understanding of human agency. It's one that emerges following the Enlightenment, which we can see quite clearly in Kantian philosophy, as the distinction between what he calls determinative judgment and reflective judgment. These are distinctions in the qualia of human agency, and they have impacts rather directly in the ways in which capitalism has developed and the ways in which we're automating it with AI. Determinative judgment is the application of rules to produce rote outcomes. It's typical of labor. This is not a kind of human agency that's highly valued in Kant's proposal. It directly leads to things like the Taylorist assembly line, where human labor is essentially pre-thought in advance, minimizing the need or role of agency in that production. In contrast, reflective judgment, this is the agency of invention, what Kant associates with what's called genius. This is very highly valued for creative activity. This is what we call agency when we talk about creative activity. What AI automates is a set of decisions made within carefully predefined rules. In other words, AI is an automation of determinative judgments. This is what machine learning is deriving, and what we get with machine learning is the matching of the imminent that we encounter right now to a carefully predefined set of past situations defined by rules. What AI makes discoveries with, and this is what something like AlphaZero is making discoveries with, is the result of a predetermined set of rules in which ramifications and applications of those rules that we do not necessarily see are articulated by the autonomous system, mapping out what all of the potential applications of those rules might be. This is why AlphaZero doesn't play like a program that we've written, it doesn't play like a person, but it plays in an alien way, as Demis Hassabis has noted. Now, what comes into this as a crucial factor is what I call the aura of the digital. This is a fantasy about digital technology that separates its impacts and costs and operations from the social dimensions and social impacts of that technology. What I call post-labor arises as an affect of this aura of the digital. It's a product of how the illusion that the digital is a self-productive domain, that it creates value without expenditure, that it separates quite irretrievably the physical from the implementation, and completely elides social impacts. The assumption that with AI there will be no more jobs for people is a reflection of this fantasy of the aura of the digital, which then makes the obvious question. If post-labor doesn't eliminate jobs, what is the society of leisure? What is it that this post-labor produces? Well, I'm using this concept to describe a collection of changed social relationships that emerge with the replacement and reduction of rote human labor by AI and automation in general. It doesn't mean that people aren't working anymore. It doesn't mean that we don't have all of the aspects that we're familiar with. It means that they're all transformed in one way or another. And that's what I'm going to talk about as I go through these 7 conclusions from Force Magnifier, my book. The first has to do with human labor. What happens when this occurs is that human labor ceases to be the foundation of value. And that ends up being very important because wealth, currency, and commodity distribution are all linked together as proxies for class distinctions, which is to say they're ultimately about labor, how it's valued, and the differential kinds of labor that people perform. This matters because in capitalism, what we call capitalism is ultimately a matter of value derived from human agency. Without human agency, there's no value, there's no distribution of value, there's no exchange values being produced. This is really a reflection of the historical definition of capitalism itself, the exchange of human productive activity, that is to say, agency, as a commodity in itself. What we need to keep in mind when talking about all of these relationships is that historically, labor is understood as unskilled, unintelligent, and only minimally educated, and that these are reflections of what the labor was for most of the history of capitalism, even into the 20th century. When we talk about human labor, we're really talking about the labor of unskilled adults and children. This is a photograph from North Carolina in the United States in 1908, showing what some of these labor conditions look like and who it is that's doing the labor. Keeping that in mind, when we talk about the 2 categories of labor that are performed in capitalism, these relationships between skilled and unskilled, child labor versus the labor of management, begins to make sense. Productive labor is these rote determinative judgments. It is readily automated. It is readily shift to an assembly line. And the shift to assembly line makes sense when you're talking about child labor. At the same time, the managerial control of that labor has tended to be regarded as reflective judgment. But what AI has revealed is that a lot of this administrative labor is actually roles that are rote, that are determinative, but that isn't actually that important. because AI is responding to a managerial fantasy in which there is a complete and total control over production, in which the determinative judgments are not filtered through the interpretations of labor, but are directly implemented. We can see this in the desire of the assembly line, in the Taylorist fragmentation of labor, in the minimizing of human thought process by that labor. Looked at in those terms, AI is simply an extension of what is already in play before its emergence. But we get a shift in value and the nature of value with AI, and this shift suggests a rupture with the historical system of capitalism and its entire productive apparatus. In capitalism, currency is a medium of exchange that is connected to the conversion of agency into a commodity. What we get in this exchange is a receipt for past labor performed, and it's this past labor performed that allows the distribution of commodities. When we have a shift in labor, so it is no longer the basis for this kind of production, it becomes no longer the basis for these kinds of exchange, and this is a disruption to the entire cycle of wages and profits. What we get with AI is a shift in the nature of value away from past production and towards futurity, towards the ability, the right to initiate production, rather than being a title to past production. The model for this kind of value production is reflective judgment, what we could call design. And as a result of that, it sets also some other historical features of creative production. And it makes them rather obvious to us. We can see at the beginning of the computer era, the computer artist, who's also one of the early computer programmers, Michael Knoll, noting that the creative process is something that happens in the mind of the artist. Its production or reflection in the artwork is simply a rendition of whatever that process is. Computers are starting to allow us to automate at least superficial dimensions of this process, as this picture by Brett Corsten, a piece called The Next Rembrandt, a computer-generated Rembrandt painting based on the work of Rembrandt, makes the model for this kind of value production really clearly performative. But it's also functionally resistant to the automation. While it may be possible to automate a Rembrandt based on Rembrandt's past works, you have to create those past works first. And then once you've created that automation, you also have to select it. Choose which work is used. And that's because creative solutions are not interchangeable. We can't take a painting by Theo van Gogh and replace it with a painting by his brother and expect them to be equivalent. Just as we can't look at the things that AIs generate on their own and expect them to be equivalent to human production, however interesting they might be to us as humans looking at these works. What that means for us is that reflective judgments become very clearly subject to what's called Belmow's cost disease, in which the generative production of creative works remains dependent on our capacity to select the result, and it's that selection that constrains the ability to generate profits. We can see that quite clearly with something like this. This picture is the selfie created by a maquette selected by nature photographer David Slater, who also allowed and enabled its production by placing cameras where the monkeys could interact with them. But because the selfie is produced by the monkey, David Slater must then select from all of the other potential selfies made by this same monkey in order to arrive at the singular image that might have value for us. Currency production, in becoming a title to initiate production, is also a shift in the nature of that currency and the nature of how commodity distribution works. Because access to commodities, that is to say the distribution of production, has always been a signifier of class position. And that matters to us because wealth functions as a proxy for class. Commodity access is also a proxy for class. Changes in the nature of currency thus do not disrupt, but instead accentuate our existing class structures. And that's because currency in a capitalist society is a mechanism controlling commodity distribution. So as the post-labor economy emerges and human labor is replaced with the unpaid operation of digital computers, this eliminates the costs of wages, and so you stop having people being paid. So the replacement of human labor with AI becomes an example of just how this aura of the digital enables the fantasy that we can extract an infinite amount of wealth from finite resources. It becomes a kind of magical production in which there is no consumption, there is no loss of profit. Now, parallel to this, we have a change in cultural authority, not its diminution, but rather its increasing, its augmentation. And in many ways, these cultural roles are already being subsumed by digital systems, by automated systems, by computers. Some of them are simply ridiculous, like this screenshot in which the computer program to play music, sound files, can't open because the screen has not enough resolution. But it's really demonstrative of something else. The idea of a pluralistic horizontal mass communication system challenges the stability of the dominant political and ideological power in any given society. That was noted 30 years ago by a video artist named Francis Torres. And while the internet and social media are clearly horizontal communication systems, what these systems have done is allow more divergent viewpoints, more valorization, more expansion, more democracy, but at the same time, it's also made the gatekeepers controlling those selections that much more powerful, that much more obvious, in part because the AI systems that run these gatekeepers, that really are the actual gatekeepers, the algorithms, are designed to maximize attention, as to say, to maximize value generation, rather than maximizing any kind of public good or social cohesion. This is a reflection of structural demands in capitalism being automated, and this structural demand for profit generation is not in itself compatible with any other demands. Any other demands have to be enforced and put upon it rather than selected automatically. The kinds of surveys that Facebook has been appropriately criticized for, like the two that you can see here, are examples of how these companies are interested in maximizing their own power, in maximizing their own profit generation, without necessarily paying any attention to legal, cultural, or social restraints. In fact, as the questionnaires here demonstrate, it's really about avoiding those kinds of constraints and accountabilities. But the autonomous editorial control and censorship that these systems produce, these gatekeepers have, makes these controls both imminent and at the same time largely invisible. What you don't get to see being censored, you don't get to see because you don't know what it was that was censored. We have here an example of that, two posts, the same post, presented at different times with some of the content removed by one of these automated systems. The cycle of wages and profits becomes something that requires social maintenance as this post-labor society emerges. It's not an issue of centrally planned production, but of enabled consumption. And enabling consumption is what allows the existing systems of distribution to continue to function. I know this diagram is just a grotesque oversimplification of these relationships, but it also captures the fundamental dynamic that the entire economic system of capitalism that has become digital, that is being transformed by automation, is a system in which wages are conceived as lost profits. And the entire idea that you cycle wages into profits and that what profits cycle back into wages is something that is fundamentally disrupted as you remove those wages from this system. The aura of the digital is the reason that these wages are being conceived as lost profits. The invention and the shift to AI enables the replacement of labor with the fixed cost of a machine. It's a system in which we're going to see and are already seeing the automation of low-status jobs becoming a concern, and increasingly a concern, as it renders human labor increasingly dependent on social supports. At the same time, it also automates higher status and high status jobs, thus eliminating the capacities of the middle class to support the economy through consumption, because it creates financial insecurity for these classes. This is a problem familiar and historical within capitalism as a whole. Joseph Schumpeter, the economist who noted after World War II that the high social dominance orientations of capitalism justifies and in many ways authorizes the deprivation of all the lower classes. What happens as this occurs is that the means of production becomes a commodity in itself. We see a shift to on-demand and just-in-time production that accompanies the elimination of standing reserves. All of these are dimensions of the same process. It's an attempt to resolve the slowing of the rate of profit, and this happens through the elimination of stored value and the conversion of all past production, not to being a source of value, but to being an expense that slows and otherwise impedes the rate of profit. The AI systems in their productive capacity, especially those that are independent of human labor entirely, allow a bespoke production of singular commodities on demand for singular audiences. This is a shift towards custom production, universal and singular production. Productive capacity is the commodity, not human labor, not the thing that it generates, the commodity itself, but actually the production. Universal basic income has been proposed as a solution to the disruption that AI poses for the cycle of wages and profits. But we need to keep in mind when confronting this that consumption, and thus wages, is a proxy for social position, and that it's not just about how much you consume, but what you consume, the costs associated with it, the status associated with it, that really define how consumption is a proxy for social position. And it's been that way for hundreds and hundreds of years. So when we look at universal basic income, what we are seeing are three general models being proposed. The first is financed through taxation and is provided as a direct governmental payout. The second is financed through debt, that is to say, a periodic jubilee that abolishes the debts, allowing the system to continue. And then the third version, which is in some ways the same version as the second one, but without the jubilee, in which you end up creating vast debts that must be repaid through obligations that are then imposed on large sections of society. But how we finance this is a question of monetary policy. And what I'm really interested in talking about today is not a question of finance, but of how social factors constrain the implication of any kind of universal basic income. In order for this to work, the goal should be, and really needs to be, to eliminate all human labor as a necessity. The reason that it needs to be the elimination of all human labor as a necessity is that if wealth remains a social marker for class, universal basic income will increase social strife and accentuate the existing divisions within society, and this will ultimately lead to it failing to preserve the social order that we have. It will instead become a driver of its breakdown. Traditional cultural ideologies are the reason that this is a problem. The society of leisure is blocked and impeded through the demonization of inactivity, the ways in which social order is justified by the social hierarchy in a reflexive and circular fashion. This is built into both religion and all forms of social support. The belief that labor is a necessary precondition for survival has been highlighted by the various and differential responses to the ongoing economic and social impacts of the virus. In many ways, the virus has acted as a magic mirror, realizing many of the things that we are talking about as hypotheticals just a year ago as imminent problems that are becoming only more obvious as time passes. We have built into our societies a cultural rejection of idleness for the lower classes. Idleness, leisure, these are concerns and preoccupations not of labor, but of management. They are reflections, the capacity to have them is a reflection of the social position of the people enjoying it. The ability to expand, to raise labor to this level where they are no longer needed, where they are furloughed, where they are idle, creates the society of leisure, but it also creates and runs directly into these historical impediments that make leisure and its consumption a class distinction. So, our pandemic has given us several very clear lessons. The first is that automation has not and is probably not going to solve any of the problems that we're encountering. In many ways, automation is simply accentuating them, and the pandemic has simply accelerated that shift. That social class is still a primary dimension of labor, and that social class really determines what we value. Ironically, the most essential kinds of labor that are being performed are the most menial, insignificant, and generally denigrated, low value, low status, low importance sorts of labor. And that's something that the pandemic has really made quite clear. At the same time, the society that we have now that's dominated by these digital technologies, these on-demand productions, this shift to immediacy, to contingency, in which we eliminate our standing reserves, has left us with a brittle society that takes very little to destabilize. It takes very little to push it into a state of, well, crisis. Even without the virus, we would be in crisis because of the ways in which people don't have the money, and we don't have the production, and we don't have the distribution of that production to support where we are now. There is no easy or simple solution to these challenges. They're emergent from the very deep, very basic foundations of our social organization, and this is a social organization that developed not for an industrial society or an automated society, but for a society based around human labor, subsistence economies, societies based on vast scarcities that are only marginally under control at any given moment. In order to make a transition to a society where we don't have that, which is something that we needed to do even before AI, and which the virus has only made that much clearer, we need to change the underlying entrenched values that block the capacities to make the adaptation, to raise people's social status, to change how we define and how we value social position in society. Any short-term solution that we would pick that might resolve these problems needs to be uniformly implemented and must have a consistent program of support and promotion from social and religious leaders in order to change and alter these foundational assumptions about how our society is organized and how our society should be based. What AI has revealed is not a financial but a social problem, not an issue of economics, but an issue of how economics, religion, and education all act together to affirm an existing social hierarchy, one that is poorly matched to the conditions that we have now, with or without the virus, accentuating and revealing the problems, in a sense, immediately as a kind of fast forward. Thank you.
Michael, thank you so much. I feel that there should be a round of applause right now, because this is the annoying thing with online conferences, that you can't easily do that. But I'm completely flabbergasted, because basically what we've spoken about here is things like universal basic income, which obviously is often, again, flouted as a very sexy PR phrase. But what precedes that is a radical socioeconomic change that people sometimes view as separate from the whole debate on AI, but actually those two are really tightly interconnected. And it's a very fine line between realizing the true interconnectivity of new innovations and the socioeconomic structures, and just kind of plain political talking about things that people, states, politicians, things that think that people want to hear, like reskilling, without any actual plan on how to do that. Because exactly as you say, if we really want to embed AI in society and help it change and propel us forward truly, and not just by installing a few apps based on very simple machine learning versions, we will need to really change the way that we think about social structure. actually going back to when I was introducing you, and obviously, your father being an archaeologist who studied the transformation of society, the Minoan society concretely, that went through a lot of very rapid changes, including writing. And script and culture and iconography. It's not actually that different from what we're talking about here now. And something that I am really fascinated by is the whole idea of multidisciplinarity and what actually encouraged you to take this viewpoint and write your book in the first place, because it's quite a cognitive leap sometimes to even dare go into the arena of AI in this type of like multifaceted way. And I'm just curious, if we start from a really big picture question from my end, how you came about it and what really gave you that impetus of, I really need to write something on this topic.
Well, it's hard to know where things like that really come from. But what I can say is that a lot of the time when I read these, and I read a great many things about AI in preparing my earlier work on digital capitalism and preparing the book and presentation for this conference, what I was struck by was just how much it was all saying the same things, and how much of it depended on at least from my perspective, being in a sense an outsider, a set of really obvious to me assumptions about how society works, what can change, what can't change. It's been said that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. And yet, a lot of the things that are being talked about with AI point towards an end of capitalism, at least as we understand it, a fundamental transformation of the whole system of value, the whole system of exchange, the whole notion of social position. If consumption is a marker for class, then industrialization undermines those markers. Historically, 200 years ago, 300 years ago, the aristocracy have a very different diet than the peasants. They have very different lives than the peasants. Not just because they're aristocracy, not just because they're peasants, that's just a shorthand for what's happening. But when you have industrialization come along, suddenly you have people eating very similar foods, having very similar products. In some cases, especially in the 20th century, they have the same products. If the Queen of England wants to drink a Coke, she's going to drink the same Coke that the bum up the street from me here in Savannah is going to drink. And no amount of money will get her a better Coke than that bum has. That's a major transformation in society, but it's one in which we really haven't thought through what that means. But we're now in the process of implementing this automated production that allows everybody to have a custom item that's completely unique and special and just for them. And in a way, we already have that. Every time you type a search into Google, you get a custom set of results just for you. If you have a Facebook page, your feed is filled with custom results just for you. And we haven't really thought about what that means. We haven't really talked about what that means. Because this custom production just for you is being made by a machine, by an automation that spies on you all the time, and then it doesn't decide on things that it thinks you would like. It presents you with things it thinks you would like that make money for its owner, which is a very different situation than something that you would like or that might be good for you. And that's why we need to think about these things in bigger and broader terms. It's not just about algorithms. It's not just about whether this algorithm or that algorithm is better or worse. It's about how does this fit together into an entire society. And too much of the time we seem to lose that society. We lose that sense of how things are connected to each other. Not just historically, but just right now. How if the Queen's Facebook page and your Facebook page are running on the same application, why is hers radically different from yours? That's something we haven't really talked about as a society.
Absolutely.
Now, I'm not really sure what the answer to these questions are, but that's why I approach things the way I do, because I want answers to these questions and I don't see them anywhere else, so I have to come up with my own. And what we're really seeing is a failure of models. The historical models that we've received don't match and don't work with the situation we're living in now. They're historical models for a historical time that has different assumptions and really very different realities than what we have created. And whatever might have worked critically to address this in the past has been incorporated and assimilated by that system. The social system, the economic system, the political system. Take your pick for what you want to call the system. And as a result, our society has changed, but our models for understanding that society don't match the changes.
Precisely. There's so many things to pick up on here. I think basically what you're talking about, there's two main things that I really want to highlight. The first is an issue of categories. I remember my old cultural anthropology tutor, Paul Dresch, he basically said that everything is a question of category, how you define culture, how you define morality, how you define values. I mean, in your presentation, we're looking at a generated painting of Rembrandt. That's considered to be, objectively a phenomenal painter, but why? Like, partially that is the politicization of Charles I's royal art collection that basically gave Rembrandt the status that he now has. Although there were plenty of other painters that had an equivalent status or were maybe even better, but obviously saying that now would be, next to blasphemous. And similarly, next to blasphemous is the notion of things like capitalism that you mentioned, because, personally, I mean, I'm from a ex-communist country, communism like ruined a lot of my family's lives, but simultaneously, almost begrudgingly, I'm kind of saying, well, capitalism, it's not sometimes the sacred cow that it says that it is, and that it's not just that I would, God forbid, want to revert to communism, but for trying to find a new model, like almost like a new world order that needs to fill the gap between the individual and society and the state that is running on those old models and it's simply not working anymore. Like, you realize that people don't want like welfare handouts. They don't want the old school plug the whole systems that used to be sufficient even 20 years ago, because suddenly they're expecting the state to give them the same level of personalization that Facebook gives you. They're expecting the state to treat them as individuals and not just like as a member of a social strata. But I think that this is symptomatic of the fact that we don't really allow sometimes for critical thinking, because it doesn't matter whether you're left, right, center. I think that all of these political spectrums have pretty much gone out of the window. But even coming out and saying, look, maybe capitalism isn't working, let's find a new system, you have to get through basically 5 boxing matches before like that is even accepted that you can think that, and you can start saying how AI can play a role in this new system that you're designing, or this new model that you're suggesting. And that's a very long-winded way of introducing my second question, which is, when you and I had this discussion, you made this like fascinating metaphor, or this fascinating statement that basically AI and like the chaos that it's kind of plunged us into, because we're running around like headless chickens because we don't know what to do with this invention that's radically changing the world around us. And it's like a natural conclusion of the Enlightenment experiment. And that's now kind of ending. That's great. And we're moving into a new world. Can you tell us a little bit more about that thought, and also maybe like your personal prediction, although I realize that it could be wild, but try anyway, of what that next stage of society might look like?
Well, I think I should first say that it's really tough making predictions, especially about the future. But when we look at something like AI, there's a very real tendency to think about it as this hard break, that it's a new thing that has no relationship to the past. And, well, I think that's a fundamental mistake, because what we see AI doing, the kind of things that it automates, when you start asking, what does AI automate? Okay, it's automating human agency. Well, okay, which agencies is it automating? The things that AI is being applied to peak at the 90th percentile of jobs. So the top 10%, the management jobs, the CEO level or C-level jobs, are not being automated. There's really no attempt to develop technology, really, to automate those jobs. And that's because those are the reflective labor jobs, reflective judgments. Those are the people who are in charge, and so they are paid enormous amounts versus the janitor. 400, 500 times the janitor's salary more, because their labor is so much more important than the person who comes and picks up the trash. And yet, the person who comes and picks up the trash is the essential labor. If they don't come and pick up your trash for 2 weeks, you're going to notice. If the CEO goes on vacation to the golf course for 2 years, you might not even realize they were missing. That's a very huge discrepancy. And it's a discrepancy in value, it's a discrepancy in labor, it's a discrepancy in essential and unessential, but it's also a discrepancy in classification of activity. Because the picking up the trash is so rote, you can build machines to do it. The CEO's labor is supposedly so not rote, you can't build machines to do it. And that's a very interesting dynamic from my point of view. But what it reveals is the continuity going back into the Enlightenment, where the idea that you can build an entire economic system around the transformation of human agency into a commodity, that is the Enlightenment. Capitalism is the economic system the Enlightenment proposes. It's enacting what the Enlightenment is describing. And instead of being emancipatory, for most of its history, it was horribly, horribly totalitarian and repressive. In many respects, your experience in the communist bloc versus the capitalist bloc, they're very similar. You have an authoritarian centralized control. It's just in the communist bloc that centralized control is the government. In the capitalist bloc, that centralized control is the corporation. But when you're inside the corporation, you are as stringently controlled, only you're freely, supposedly, able to leave and change jobs. But in actuality, that's heavily constrained in places like the United States. Right now, leaving your job means you also leave behind your health insurance. So you have no health care. Uh-oh, that's a problem right now in places like the United States that tie that to your employment. And that's one of the things that's really becoming obvious, just how catastrophic that is, at least in the United States to the Americans. But it's a reflection of the same idea that the person in charge, their judgment matters, no one else's judgment matters. The reflective individual who creates and determines what the rules should be versus the people who apply the rules. And that distinction there runs through everything that we talk about in the Enlightenment. It runs through the entire Enlightenment project. It distinguishes different kinds of education, why some education is devalued. Let's say you go and get a job to learn to be a plumber. You're not going to be treated with the same social level of respect as if you go and get a job to become a philosopher. It's just the idea that the plumber and the philosopher are receiving the same training doesn't even seem rational. That's this differential in reflective versus determinative. I like Kant because he makes this distinction very, very clear. But it's something that runs through all of the Enlightenment, and the capitalist system is a reflection of this. And ironically, the way communism rolled out and was implemented, is still being implemented, is also a reflection of this system, where you have the state making the decisions for everyone else, who is then subject to and controlled by those decisions. It's the same system.
Yeah, it's what I find really interesting is like the nature of the scientific method as such, because even if we look at the origins of, say, archaeology, anthropology, or even biology, and like going all the way back to Linnaeus, we see during the Enlightenment this propensity to categorize everything and to show how things go from point A to point B. I personally think that, and there is historical evidence that humans have always had some kind of like cognitive propensity to explain the world around them. They either did it through religion or magic, or then later rigorous science, which sometimes has very similar findings to something that David Copperfield might produce, because it is basically like often like the hypothesis building and it's proving, making differences between the Western scientific method and something that the Zande in sub-Saharan Africa do with their oracles is actually based on a very similar principle, but obviously colonialism has made one superior to the other. But what we basically see is, and you know, emergent from that are things like eugenics, that basically you need to suddenly categorize everything around you and give it some kind of a number and some kind of a level in the pyramid to be able to shift society forward and to basically optimize it. But I think that this has actually really ruined, like almost pre-ruined the legacy of AI, because AI is merciless in the sense that it's completely unbiased. Like it doesn't care what data you give it, but you have to give it some kind of data so it can train. The problem is that the data that we have collected over the last 150 years isn't exactly like a great reflection on us, but that's not AI's fault. And what honestly always makes me really sad when I see something about like a racist algorithm or like a gender biased algorithm, the algorithm's got nothing to do with it. It's the cesspool that is either social media or just like humans that it's basically revealing. So it's, again, we discussed this before, it's revealing biases, not necessarily creating them. And my question to you is, where do you think that we should draw the line? Because obviously like you can like manually mute the algorithm or like create it so that it makes you very happy and so that it erases all these problematic parts and makes us look fantastic. But then you're basically bastardizing science. Or you can say, yep, take the data. It's not going to be pretty, but at least we know what we're dealing with, and we can deal with the post-hoc situation in its true form. Where do you, and obviously regulations and the state are the ones making these decisions often, sadly. Where do you think the line is drawn, and how do you think that we should approach this from the state perspective, but also the corporate perspective, treating those kind of equally, given on what you just said. But then also, how do you think that the public should be engaged in this? Because it's often the public's data that are being used to train these algorithms in the first place. So I feel that they should have a say.
Well, right now there's a whole lot of talk about data as like the new oil. It's the new commodity, that everybody needs it. But in many ways, the technology is already in the process of moving away from this big data approach, where we're already starting to build systems that derive all of their data autonomously. You give them a rule set, they apply the rule set, and in applying that rule set, generate all of the potential outcomes. This is something like AlphaGo in the way it plays Go or chess, or AlphaZero, which has no data. That's why it's called zero. But the problem is we keep thinking about and talking about bias like it's something separate from that we can remove it, like it's eliminable. Like you know, the bias is there, but if we take it out, then everything's fine. But you can't take the bias out. Bias is inevitable. Bias is in some ways something you cannot eliminate. You can only mitigate it. And we need to be talking not about eliminating bias, but mitigating it, about imposing controls so that we don't autonomously generate negative outcomes that we don't want and not even know we're doing it, which is the real danger of these kinds of biases built into AI systems. And the reason for that is most of these AIs do not have transparency, accountability, or explainability. We don't know what they're doing or where the data is coming from. We don't know how that data has been selected. It's not accountable to anyone. There is nobody saying, there is no office or business or organization that looks at the data and says, okay, is this data itself inherently biased if we're building from data? And there's very little attempt to explain any of this. The technology is left as, like you said, a kind of magical effect. This is the aura of the digital, that it's a magical thing that just generates value. You turn the crank and money comes out. And those are things that we have to consciously work against, because they're ideologies that in many ways our technology has reified, that our technology internally references consistently as justifications for how it operates and as ways of evading any kind of oversight. Now, whether this oversight is internal to a corporation or from a government or even transnational is a different issue than the issue of bias. They get bundled together because very often the only way to address bias is through this kind of oversight. So we tend to think of oversight and bias as being the same thing. You have the bias, you have the oversight that corrects it. But we need to think about them as separate issues. How we have oversight is not the same as how we have bias, because the bias is never going to go away. Nothing that we do will ever eliminate it. If you have to make a selection from 10 options, you're going to make a choice, and that choice is going to be biased for the other options that you didn't select. So it's always going to be a political question, what we call bias and how we address it. What we need to do to address it is to make it into something that everyone involved is at least on a level playing field, has the same information. Right now, so many of these algorithms are trade secrets. They're locked up behind closed doors. The data is kept secret. It is kept hidden. It is proprietary. That makes any kind of oversight almost impossible. And as Facebook has demonstrated repeatedly, as Google has demonstrated repeatedly, as Microsoft has demonstrated repeatedly, even as Ford Motor Company has demonstrated repeatedly, or Volkswagen has demonstrated repeatedly, or any corporation has demonstrated repeatedly. When they're motivated by profits, we cannot trust them to oversight themselves.
It's a really interesting thing that you've pointed out, which is basically, again, it's almost not a question of access to AI, or the technology. It's access to information about AI, because I've spoken to a lot of friends who have worked in these grand corporations who shall remain nameless. And the people actually working hands-on with these algorithms that are behind closed doors, they're very explainable. Often they're actually like almost not childishly simple, but they're really not the rocket science that they claim to be in the PR manifests that come out about them. But obviously, these people can't speak about it because of the nature of their employment contract. If these people these people that I know have definitely tried to make it open source, which would mean democratizing the technology, getting it out there. That's a huge internal battle. That's intellectual property of the company. Even if you do it in your own time, it's still their intellectual property. So they basically own your brain. And speaking out about the fact, obviously, the company is never going to allow you to say, oh, this algorithm that's like running half of the internet is actually pretty simple. It's basically a statistical model. But I can't say that because I'd be kicked out and I'd be hounded till the ends of the earth. But then what basically happens is this Chinese whispers where you've got the very mundane like AI reality at the bottom, and you've got people mystifying it until it gets to the CEO levels or like the C-level people who maybe like joined the company like 10 years ago, but that's already like ancient by the state of like modern technology development. So they're actually not even hands-on anymore, and they don't properly know what is going on like underneath the hood of the car. And then basically, but who are the people then talking to the politicians who are making the regulations? It's these C-level people who don't even properly know what's going on inside their business. And then the politicians have no idea often, and they just like cherry pick whatever's like best for their digital strategy, and they go, voila. I read this thing about the EU regulations, I think it was yesterday, where basically we need to regulate AI so that it's only used for purposes that like don't harm humans or cause death. It's like AI is not going to cause death. It's a statistical model. It's the people that are using it in a terrible way to, I don't know, switch off energy in a city that is going to cause death. And it's this access to information that is creating, as you mentioned, the aristocracy, this new meat-eating elite that's got access, but not necessarily knowing all the facts about what's going on underneath them. And again, this is like a long-winded way of saying that throughout history, we always see people organize themselves in some form of pyramid or in some form of model. Do you think that we need to work with the fact that whatever system comes next, even if it tries to be utopian and like universal basic income, having like AI powering our society, that it's still going to be biased because there's something that's been in us for millions of years that we just can't get rid of because we're humans? To what extent do you think that our society truly is malleable and that we can get rid of those models, or that we're going to be stuck in a rut, doomed to repeat the same mistakes?
Well, that's a great question, and that really is the question about this technology. And to be honest with you, I don't know. I do know that our society, and even historically, when you get above a certain level of complexity, societies invent their own hierarchies. And the hierarchies happen for a variety of reasons. And it's not the issue of the hierarchy that's the problem. It's the issue of how you administer the society within that hierarchy. If it's a hierarchy constructed so that the people at the top are allowed and encouraged to prevent anyone below them from getting whatever it is that they need, from getting whatever it is that is required just to survive, and then they are punished for it and taught to dislike themselves and internalize the punishment, so that if they're not working harder and faster and better and more, then they're bad, which is really the last 250 years, then yes, of course we're going to have problems. Now, is it possible to imagine other sorts of society? Certainly. Are they utopian? Not all of them. Many of them could very well resemble the society we have now. It's simply a matter of to what extent do you build a society that authorizes and enables this vast disparity between the person at the top and the person at the bottom. And that disparity is a very recent invention. In the United States, it's less than 50 years old. After World War II, the disparity was orders of magnitude smaller in the United States. And the country was more egalitarian. It was able to adapt and, in fact, embrace some kinds of social change that it's now struggling with as the economic disparity has increased once more. In many ways, without that amelioration of social position and social distinction expressed through consumption, expressed through disparities in wealth and value, it's very hard to imagine something like the civil rights movement succeeding. It's easy to forget that a big part of the civil rights movement is organizations like the SDS, the Students for a Democratic Society, who are largely white, affluent, and liberal. And without that additional support, maybe civil rights might not have happened the way it did. It might not have happened at all. It might have been put down in the 1950s, the way the South in the United States was trying very aggressively to put it down. The Freedom Riders were not all black. Many of them were also white. Many of them were Asian. And it's hard to imagine that today, with the society being so polarized in the United States, with many societies being just as polarized internationally, that achieving a more just, a more democratic society means achieving a society like that for everyone. Not just addressing the economic disparity, not just addressing disparities in social position, but in working actively to reduce those disparities. And it is possible to imagine other societies. We've seen them imagined as recently as 50 years ago. But our contemporary moment has trouble imagining something happening a year ago, remembering something happening 10 years ago. The turn of the century is, it seems, especially from the perspective of 2020, to be in some other world. And yet it's only 20 years. So most of what we need is a little more perspective. Now, the problem with telling and saying we need more critical thought, more critical discussion, is that most of industrialization has been about telling people not to do that, not to engage in that critical thought is above their social standing, it's above their pay grade, as I've heard people say. And that's a problem too. But that's what I mean when I say we have to, as a society, choose to change the values of how we distinguish and how we organize society.
Absolutely. Yeah, and the whole idea of even like popularizing science, I've come across so many times that you have people from top academic institutions, and they actually feel sickened by the fact that they would have to cheapen their work and digest it for the public. Maybe I'm saying this in a little bit of an extreme way, but the idea of like giving something to the public is often seen as like degrading it, whereas actually, or it's seen as communist, and it's none of those things. It's actually just like making information accessible and this democratizing society, which is what the internet has been doing basically as a byproduct by accident for the last 10 years especially. But I would love to chat, but fortunately / unfortunately, we have questions from the audience. I have to shut up. And I have to give them precedence. But they're fantastic questions. And the first one is, what have experiments with the universal basic income revealed, or are the models employed to date overly flawed? And I also am very aware that we have roughly 4 minutes, 3 minutes until the end.
I can answer that quickly. The biggest flaw with universal basic income is the fact that we haven't actually had it roll out at scale.
Mm.
All of the experiments are 100 people, 500 people, 1,000 people. This is little more than a handout to a small group.
Mm-hmm.
Do universal basic income on a state scale and see what happens.
Absolutely.
Not just a one-time stimulus check, but actually roll it out and see what happens. That's something nobody has tried or even done. So we really can't say whether it's going to work or fail or anything, because we have some models, We have a couple of tiny test cases. We have no idea what happens at scale.
Yeah, so a true rollout rather than a proof of concept, as is popular with many startups. And actually, maybe you could even give a yes or no answer to this, if possible. There's basically a question whether, as AI becomes more prominent and traditional labor becomes less so, do you think that professions in art and culture will become more popular and attain a more central standing in society?
Traditional art and culture? Probably not, but it depends on what you mean. If you include things like video games, animated content, including photorealistic animated content, which is what's coming next, it's already here in some ways, then sure. But it also means that you're not going to have the cultural gravitas around a seminal work like, say, Moby Dick. When everybody has their own version of Moby Dick, where they get to be Ishmael, or they get to be one of the other characters, or they get to build Queequeg's coffin, it becomes kind of weirdly horrifying if you have that traditional set of values in mind. But it's a different set of ideas. Benjamin Franklin commented 300 years ago that the idea of everybody being creative sounded absolutely horrible to him, because then no one would buy his books.
And that's when profit is key to what you're doing. Michael, thank you so much. It's been such a stimulating discussion. I'm sure that you and I will have a bit of a follow-up on this as well. And it's been a real honor being able to moderate this discussion. I'd really like to hand over, well, no, I don't want to hand over because I'd like to stay here and chat, but I have to hand over for the sake of time to the moderator back at the studio. I've been Sarah, and this has been a great sneak peek into your book, which I encourage everyone to run and get. As well as a beautiful summary of the role of AI in society from a multidisciplinary perspective. Thank you.
No, thank you for having me.
Sarah Pollock and Michael Betancourt, thank you so much for that very profound exchange, and also proving that critical thought should be above nobody's pay grade, and what the reasons for that are, I think was highlighted by your debate. Thanks so much. And with that talk, I would like to wrap up today's second day of the AI week of here the Aspen Institute in Germany. And I would also like to invite you to take part tomorrow, because this continues for another 3 days, and just give you a quick outlook on what's going to happen tomorrow. On December the 9th, the third day of the AI week here, there will be a keynote presentation by Jana Köhler, on the scientific director of the Algorithmic Business and Production Research Department at the German Research Center for Artificial Intelligence. So the titles are getting longer here. There'll be a debate on the big player startups and the innovation paradox. And there will be a conversation in English with Mustafa Suleyman, the co-founder of DeepMind and vice president of artificial intelligence at Google. So with that, we leave you for today and hope very much that you'll tune in back tomorrow on Wednesday for the AI week here at the Aspen Institute. Thanks so much for being with us today.